about emulators. Emulators are very important and very popular right now, so much so that we got an extra half session after the break. So if you're really interested in this, be sure to come back. So I'm Claudia Tebaldi. I convened this session with Sonia Seneviratne, who couldn't make it here, but is probably online, and maybe she can say a few words after I finish mine. We have a nice lineup of talks today. We have 8 talks that we could accommodate thanks to the generosity of the scheduling. They are divided into 2 blocks because, as you probably know, emulators can be somewhat categorized into 2 broad classes. The kind of emulators that you use to connect working group 1 type of research to working group 3. So those that are useful to characterize mitigation research, to aid mitigation research, and then that category of emulators that instead thinks about creating climate information for impact modeling. So originally we thought the latter category would go first, but then we had to accommodate somebody that is in California, so 9 hours behind us, that is talking instead about the first type. So we have switched the order that you may have seen online somewhere. So we are going Housefather, Jenkins, Smith, Bossi, and then Wells, Kilkay, Nath, Wells, Kilkay, and myself. That is going to be awkward when it's time for introductions. So I think I'll stop here, maybe I should say that my vision for the scheduling is that the speaker should try to keep it to 10 minutes, 10, 11, 12 at most. We may take some pressing questions from the audience, but then either in between the 2 blocks or at the end of the session, we can have at least a few minutes to discuss. Now, if Sonia is online and wants to say anything, this is the time. If not, we'll start listening to Zeke. Sonia, are you there? Can you hear me now? Yay! Hi, Sonia. No, you're muted, or we cannot hear you. Yes?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, great. Yeah, and also sorry I couldn't make it in person because of a health problem in my family, but I'm really looking forward to this session. I think we have many exciting presentations, and so I don't want to say much, just to say that I'm looking forward to the presentation, and really, as Claudia mentioned, this is a very exciting topic and emerging topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. So, Zeke, I think we are ready for you.
Perfect. Just to double check, are you going to play the recorded one, or shall I give it live?
Oh, yes, you're right. We play the recording, and then you are there to answer questions. I forgot about that. And the same for Stuart later. Yes, thank you for, for remembering that.
Happy either way.
Yes. So can we play Housefather's video, please? So can he share his screen and do it now? Zeke, it sounds like the video is not working, so if you can share slides and talk.
Sure.
Great, okay.
I am more than happy to give the presentation right now.
Okay, great. We are so good.
No worries. So thank you, everyone. I will try to keep it in 10 minutes. Let me bring out a quick timer. So I'm going to talk today about a little bit of ongoing work on a probabilistic exploration of climate outcomes using the FAIR model. And this is a project that involves myself, Camilla Matherson, Chris Smith, Richard Betts, Ben Sanderson, Chris Jones, Pierre Friedlingstein, Talia Resnick, and Glenn Peters. And so one of the impetuses for this project was to sort of try to resolve some mixed messages in the IPCC 6th Assessment Report on carbon signal feedbacks Specifically, different parts of Working Group 1 were arguing both that differences in the few ESMs for which both emissions and concentration-driven runs were available for the same scenario are small and do not affect the assessment of global temperature projections. However, in other parts of Working Group 1, it was mentioned that higher end warming projections, e.g. from scenarios like the 8.5 one, cannot be ruled out because of uncertainties in carbon cycle feedbacks, which in nominally lower emissions trajectories can result in projected concentrations that are higher than the central concentration levels typically used to drive model projections. In other words, in one part, it's argued that these carbon cycle feedbacks have relatively minor effects on surface temperature projections, and another, it's essentially argued that we can't rule out very high-end warming scenarios and high-end concentration scenarios because of these carbon cycle feedback uncertainties. So we wanted to look at this problem through a number of different lenses, and one of those was using some emulators like FAIR to assess the uncertainties here. One of the challenges we have today, we don't have a great understanding of the uncertainty in carbon cycle feedback responses under different scenarios. So this is a figure that Richard Betts and I put together for an analysis we did back in 2020, where we essentially looked at two different sets of estimates of carbon cycle feedbacks, both for the CMIP5 C4MIP experiments, which is the first column, and the HAD-CM3 perturbed physics ensemble experiments, which is the second column. The black horizontal line in this case represents the prescribed concentrations in each of those RCPs, and each of the dots is a different realization of 2100 concentrations in each of these experiments. Now, the challenge with C4MIP is while it provides results from a diversity of different climate models, it is very much an ensemble of opportunity. Every model is trying to provide their best single carbon cycle representation, and there's not really any sort of thorough exploration of the parameter space underlying these carbon cycle feedbacks. The perturbed physics ensemble, on the other hand, is a very thorough examination of the parameter space, but using a single model, and a fairly dated model at that, HAD-CM3. And so while it gives us a much wider range of carbon cycle feedback estimates, it doesn't necessarily give us the diversity of models that C4MIP gives us. And so the main point of this slide is that there are just large uncertainties remaining in these carbon cycle feedbacks, and they can have big effects on resulting concentrations. You know, in one extreme case, you could have RCP 8.5 prescribed concentrations in an RCP6 emissions pathway for sort of the single highest estimate of carbon cycle feedbacks in the perturbed physics ensemble. And so as I mentioned, C4MIP, which we tend to rely on a lot and relied on in Working Group 1 for our understanding of carbon cycle feedbacks uncertainty, is very much an imperfect proxy. In CMIP6, there are only 11 models participating in C4MIP. They were all running a single scenario, SSP 5.5, and they gave a similar range to their concentration-driven counterparts with a slightly lower central estimate of about 0.1 C and an uncertainty of about 0.1 C, or a larger uncertainty by about 0.1 C. But again, the small sample size we have here makes it difficult to draw strong conclusions, and the lack of a large ensemble of runs also makes it difficult to disentangle a signal from the internal variability, because often if you run the same climate model multiple times, you might get a result that's about 0.1 C different simply due to internal variability. So we can use emulators like FAIR to help separate out these uncertainties. The uncertainties due both to carbon cycle feedbacks and to other climate system uncertainties like climate sensitivity. And so for this, we looked at a few different experiments and some ways to sort of diagnose the relevant carbon cycle parameters in emulators like FAIR. In this plot, we did 3 different experiments. The first experiment, we constrained climate sensitivity, both TCR and ECS, to 3C per doubling CO2, and the, forget off the top of my head, but the sort of median TCR estimate in the AR6, and ran a couple thousand different runs only that are driven by emissions. And so explored the resulting uncertainty in carbon cycle feedbacks and the temperature response associated with that in the first column. In the second column, we ran prescribed concentrations, but varied the climate sensitivity using the sort of climate sensitivity range from the AR6, the likely and very likely ranges. And then the blue is the sort of combined uncertainty of the two. And it is interesting to note here that the combined uncertainty ends up actually being very similar to the climate sensitivity uncertainty alone. The reason for this is that these uncertainties are mostly independent, so you effectively end up adding them in quadrature. And whenever you add a smaller uncertainty and a larger uncertainty in quadrature, the larger uncertainty effectively dominates the results. And so essentially the odds of getting both a very high climate sensitivity and a very high carbon cycle feedback in the sort of joint combination of these is relatively small. But this raises an important question of how we should think about uncertainties here. Because the uncertainties are somewhat independent, as I mentioned, the odds of both happening at the same time are quite small. However, for a given estimate of climate sensitivity, say we knew climate sensitivity was 3 super doubling, there still is a reasonably large and somewhat poorly constrained uncertainty associated with carbon cycle feedbacks. It's about 0.2 C in SSP2 4.5, for example. It would be close to twice that in SSP5 8.5. And that is, again, just using the existing FAIR parameterization, which is very similar to what we get for C4MIP. If you were to use a larger carbon cycle feedback uncertainty, such as what we find in the perturbed physics ensemble for HADCM3, you'd get a much larger uncertainty as a response to that. So if we want to use emulators like FAIR to examine carbon cycle feedback uncertainties, it's important for us to be able to effectively parameterize them. And the way that they're designed right now, they do not take things like the beta and gamma parameters. So beta being the carbon cycle response to atmospheric CO2, and gamma being the response to temperature. Those are not inputs into the models. And so what we did in these experiments was essentially derive a way to back out the beta and gamma parameters in C4MIP. And this shows the distribution of those parameters and sort of the probability distribution across 1 million runs of FAIR, and it compares it to various previous C4MIP experiments, which are demarcated by the cyan, red, and green lines. I actually don't have written down which they are, but it's in my recorded talk. Similarly, we also can diagnose the gamma parameter in FAIR, and again, the blue is the distribution for 1 million member ensemble of FAIR, and compared to the various C4MIP experimental results, which are shown by the colored lines for the previous 3 generations of C4MIP. And here we see both beta and gamma end up being relatively similar in distribution to that we see in C4MIP, but again, narrower than what we would see in, say, the HADCM3 experiments that we discussed earlier. And so now that we've developed ways to diagnose these parameters in FAIR, we can more easily examine cases where the parameter distribution might be much wider and see how that would affect the resulting uncertainties. And finally, we can then apply these uncertainties in carbon cycle feedbacks to look at various relevant metrics. So here is a quick examination of the impact of carbon cycle feedback uncertainties in global warming level exceedance. So as folks in the audience probably know quite well, there's been a big push to focus a lot of climate impacts literature in recent years on global warming levels rather than emission scenarios. But that means that translating emission scenarios into global warming levels, particularly in a probabilistic sense, is a very important exercise. And so this is looking at a 2,400 member ensemble of FAIR, and the probability in each year of exceeding different global warming levels. This is for the SSP2 4.5 scenario. And here the solid lines are the emissions driven runs, and the dashed lines are sort of prescribed, more standard prescribed concentration runs. And interestingly enough, at least in the default parameterization of FAIR, the difference between the emission driven runs and the concentration driven runs is actually relatively small, which is a little encouraging. It means that we're probably not missing out on, at least given the default parameterization, huge uncertainties in carbon cycle feedbacks in the prescribed concentration runs. But again, if we look at other experiments like the perturbed physics ensemble that have a much wider range of concentration outcomes, if we were to do variants of FAIR that had much wider carbon cycle feedback uncertainties, it could change these results. And we're hoping to examine some of those in the future. Similarly, we can look at the same graph for SSP5 8.5 and look at the probability of exceedance over time in different years under both the concentration-driven and emission-driven runs, which can be helpful for looking at the relative effects of each. So to conclude with a few takeaways here, carbon cycle feedback uncertainties remain relatively poorly constrained and are not reflected in most future warming projections, which primarily are concentration-driven outside of the relatively small number of emission-driven runs from Earth system models. However, current estimates for carbon cycle feedback uncertainties are generally fairly small relative to climate sensitivity uncertainties and result in a modest effect on resulting combined future warming uncertainties. And then finally, and this is why it's very relevant for the discussion here, emulators like FAIR can play a useful role in exploring the interactions of uncertainties, including emissions uncertainties in the future, that can be used to assess the effect of different carbon cycle feedback estimates in literature. So we're hoping to take the approach that we're building out here and apply it both to different ranges of carbon cycle feedback uncertainties, and also to try to quantify some of the emerging literature on emissions uncertainties associated with things like current policy scenarios, and then be able to sort of look at the respective uncertainties across emissions, climate sensitivity, and carbon cycle feedback, and how they sort of interact with each other and combine together. So that is all I have here, and happy if there's time to take a question or two.
Thank you, Zeke. Also, thank you for setting a good example in terms of timekeeping. So Zeke is actually in California, so for him it's midnight and 20 minutes past midnight. So I'd like to give him a little bit more than just pressing questions, because maybe he can choose to then go to bed. So please, let's start here. I also want to mention to the people online that they can post questions in the comment window of our session page.
Thanks very much, Zeke. Great talk. In Working Group 1, we really struggled to work out how to assess the emulators from an emissions-driven point of view, because as you say, there's not that much evidence. One of the questions I had, looking at your combined uncertainties, the fact that the combined uncertainty is very similar to the climate uncertainty really hinges on this assumption of independence between carbon cycle uncertainties and climate uncertainties, like you said. My question is, what evidence do we have to make that assumption of independence?
So that's a good question. You know, obviously there are some reasons to expect they wouldn't be fully independent. You know, there is a carbon cycle response to temperature, which is sort of the gamma parameter. You know, at the same time, the value of that parameter we see in emulators like FAIR is fairly similar to, you know, the value we see for C4 MIP experiments. So, you know, I don't think they are fully independent, and I don't think the emulator is necessarily even treating them as fully independent. But I think that at least in C4 MIP and in the sort of parameterizations of FAIR, the range of carbon cycle feedbacks is small enough that it doesn't show up as a hugely large value, at least in the combined uncertainties. I think it would be interesting to look, and this is something we're hoping to do in the next iteration of this project, at some, you know, wider estimates of carbon cycle feedback uncertainties and see how those would affect the combined uncertainties here. But I agree that, you know, it is not safe to assume that they are independent. And in fact, there's reasons to think that they probably would not be.
Hi, Jan Kilkai. So thank you very much for this interesting talk. And just, I was thinking that maybe we should do, so we had this intercomparison exercise RCMIP for the comparison mostly on the climate system for the simple climate models. Maybe we should do the same for the carbon cycle. What do you think about it?
I think it would be a very useful idea. I mean, right now, C4 MIP is the primary game in town, and I think that both the more resources we can have to expand that, and the more we can explore some more sort of perturbed physics types approaches, I think the better understanding we can get of the carbon cycle. You know, one interesting dynamic is, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we saw such a wider range of carbon cycle feedback responses in the perturbed physics ensemble than C4 MIP, and that's very interesting. And I suspect that there probably is some herding, so to speak, of carbon cycle parameterizations in Earth system models. Again, because it's an ensemble of opportunity, every model is picking a single parameterization they think is best. And so having ways to more structurally explore those, I think would be really helpful. And certainly give us a better understanding. It's also worth mentioning that much wider range we saw for the perturbed physics ensemble is constrained to ensure that CO2 concentrations agree with the historical record. So there's, you know, you're making sure there's nothing too crazy historically based on the parameter choices.
Thanks. What I meant, it's also on, here you use FAIR, a simple climate model, and there's also MAGIC and Hector and Oscar and so on and so forth. So maybe the outputs would be different if using different simple climate models, hence having the comparison of them would be interesting in knowing what everyone is doing, and if this trying to have different estimates for these carbon climate feedbacks.
No, I agree, and better understanding how each of the simple climate models is representing carbon cycle feedback uncertainties, I think, is important, because given the limitations of our ability to do lots of Earth system model runs for these experiments, the more we can use emulators to explore uncertainties and emission-driven runs, I think the better it is for the community in terms of the types of analyses we can do.
Okay, in the interest of time, I think we need to move on. Zeke, thank you so much for being available at this hour and for the interesting talk. And we go on now to the next, and of course I lost my, yes, I think it's, the next is Stuart. Bye, Zeke. Feel free to stay if you like. Stuart, it's your turn, and I think we have the same problem in the sense that your video doesn't work, and so I'm hoping that, like Zeke, you are an impromptu artist and you can give us your talk.
Yeah, hi everyone, that should be fine. I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, great, okay. So this is some work that I've been doing with Aaron and Matt and Miles and myself at the University of Oxford, so we've been thinking about this idea of building an emulator for integrated assessment model simulations over a few years now, but really in the last year, Aaron has pushed this forward a lot. So a lot of this is down to kind of his progression of the idea. So starting off, we have the kind of Earth system model world, and what a lot of these talks that we're going to listen to today are about emulating the kind of physical climate response to emissions and concentrations driven runs. And the reason that we kind of built these simplified climate models is because an Earth system model is all well and good, and it's the most kind of complete and full complexity simulation of the climate system that we have, but they're very computationally expensive to run. And because of the large number of parameters that you're sampling when you're trying to study them, you get these emergent behaviors that can take quite a long time to pull apart and understand. And so simplified models give us a tool to navigate these challenges and sample a wide parameter space and really try and understand from a kind of bare bones level what's going on in terms of the global responses of the climate system. So the same problem exists for integrated assessment models, right? So they're extremely complicated systems. They're full of a huge number of parameters, very expensive to run computationally, meaning that if you want to try and understand a particular kind of output, understanding which parameters that you chose that go on to create that behavior, that emergent behavior, can be quite challenging. And that creates a problem, particularly when these models are relied upon to produce kind of very policy relevant outcomes and outputs. And so one way that we've been thinking that we could simplify that world is in the same way that emulators in our system models provide a means to do large parameter ensembles and explore a really wide range of mitigation scenarios and really fill in the gaps between what is capable of being run in an Earth system model. The same thing should be possible for an integrated assessment model. So here I'm going to talk about a very simplified form that we've got for emulating behavior between the carbon price and these three key variables. There's the amount of CO2 production that a model decides to output, the amount of CO2 emissions that's associated with, and therefore the amount of CO2 storage that comes along with that. So the first point is the carbon price and understanding what the various models say happens to the carbon price. So this is just a figure from the sixth assessment report, working group 3 from the IIM chapter 3, in which you have these various assessments of the carbon price in 2030, 2050, 2100 across a range of scenarios. So where green C1 scenario is the highest ambition scenario with the highest carbon prices across the century, and the red scenario is the lowest ambition scenarios across the 21st. You see that even though there's a little bit of kind of play there across the ensembles, there's reasonably good agreement that a kind of exponentially rising carbon price isn't a bad assumption for each of these models, and a lot of the time that's because it's an exogenous constraint that's been applied to the model. And of course it's not perfect across the ensemble, but if you take any individual model and scenario setup, then you find that actually a exponentially rising carbon price is a pretty good approximation for what we see here. So that gives us our starting point for what we're going to assume happens with the carbon price across the 21st century. And then we need some relationship between the carbon price and our three output variables. So the first thing that we tried, and this was a few years ago now, we tried to model the relationship between carbon price and CO2 emissions directly. And we came up with this marginal abatement cost curve form, which gives you an abatement, so a fractional reduction in a baseline emissions policy because of the carbon price. So if it's at 0, then you've got no abatement and you're along the baseline trajectory. And if you're at 1, then you've completely abated and your emissions are at net 0. And it has this functional form, a sigmoid type shape, driven by a carbon price P, and then these few parameters. So you have some time scale of increase in the carbon price, parameter R, some time scale of transition from low levels of abatement to high levels of abatement in S, some maximum theoretical level of abatement, which for the emissions output is somewhere just above 1, 1.2 perhaps for a lot of these scenarios, building in a quantity of negative emissions, which is assumed in a lot of the high ambition integrated assessment model scenarios. And then this transition carbon price P0.5, which tells you about the price that you need to reach to precipitate a lot of the abatement out of the system. And we found that we could model the emissions to the carbon price to emissions relationship pretty well here. It's not perfect for some individual models like Message, which are very smooth. We got very good fits, but it's not perfect for sure. And so we decided to try and pull this apart further, and we looked at the carbon price to CO2 production relationship with the same marginal abatement cost curve form, but now with the maximum abatement limited to 1, because we're talking about how much CO2 production reduces, and you can maximally reduce your CO2 production down to by 100%. A lot of the models don't achieve 100% reduction, but this marginal abatement cost curve form, as I've just fitted the two extremes of the kind of 5th and 95th percentile of the plume of scenarios in the SL15 database here. And you can see that it captures the kind of range, and you can imagine varying the parameters within this will capture most of the individual scenarios within this group. So that gives us a carbon price to CO2 production relationship. And then the last thing we need is a carbon price to CO2 storage relationship, which again takes a sigmoid-like form, because a lot of the models go through this period of kind of slow uptake and then a rapid transition, followed by some saturation type behavior towards the end of the 21st century. And so that's what we're trying to emulate. And again, you have this, these parameters that govern the maximum amount of CCS that you believe you can deploy. Some transition rate, which we find is typically around a kind of quadratic, somewhere around a quadratic, and a transition price, which governs the price at which the model starts to build rapidly a lot of CCS. And so this is for some fixed, so I think that here we're only varying S max and we're holding P of the 50% transition cost fixed, just to see what that looks like. But we have done a wider sampling of parameters as well. I'm not going to go into details of what we find here, but the point being that in a very similar way that you can explore the physical climate response by fitting a simple climate model, say FAIR, to a range of system model outputs, and then you can kind of pull apart what those parameters mean in terms of the sampling of the actual like physical response space. You can do that with the physical, with the kind of economic and physical parameters that we're pulling apart from this model, which is nice and helpful. And so finally, I just want to go very quickly through a couple of use cases. So we have this relationship at the moment that you can give the model a carbon price, and then from that you'll derive a CO2 production time series, a CO2 emissions time series, and a CO2 storage time series. So we're kind of 2/3 of the way to being able to calculate a social cost of carbon in a kind of dice-like model kind of way. And to complete that, and in order to do that, then we need an estimate of the damage function, which here, so we take a form that Miles talked about in a 2016 paper that he wrote. But essentially, it's the formulation that DICE uses, where you have some exogenous assumed GDP growth, and then some temperature-mediated damage to that growth, which gives you some quantity of damage at time t because of the GDP growth and because of the temperature time series increasing. And so given that, then we can iterate, so we give the model an input temperature time series, that gives us a damage outcome, from which we can calculate a social cost of carbon time series over the 21st century, and use that like a carbon price to then, in our emulator, to figure out what CO2 production you'd get and what CO2 emissions you'd get. And then you can repeat that running it again and again, and it harmonizes towards a kind of best future trajectory given the damage that you're going to receive because of that warming. And the point being that we can do something that you could do in an integrated assessment model, but is extremely computationally expensive, that you can't do in what Miles did in 2016. So Miles in 2016 used the kind of analytical approach. He used an equation set to show the relationship between peak warming and 100% abatement costs, so the cost of the backstop technology, essentially. And he showed that in a DICE-like model, you get these straight lines depending on your assumed GDP growth rate for the relationship between the peak warming level and the cost of your 100% abatement technology. And so the first thing that we did was we went through with our emulator and we showed that under a range of IAM constrained parameter sets, you produced this relationship if you assumed a DICE-like damage function, where the scatter is what we find, more specifically what Aaron found in his master's project. And they lie very nicely over what Miles found for the analytical result in 2016, which is a nice like reproduction of that study. But then we can go on to do some more interesting things, like figure out when we can break that study. So here is a different formulation of the damage function in which we have changed the damage function to actually impact the rate of GDP growth, which it's not assumed happens in the standard formulation. So we follow a study, Prentice et al. 2018, to derive a percentage change in GDP for a given level of warming. And we show that that completely breaks the relationship that was found from the analytical results. So we can do some interesting things that would be quite difficult to achieve in both an integrated assessment model world because of the computational expense, and also you can't do numerically. And then finally, just one other very quick use case example. Here's some work we've done on comparing price-driven scenarios. So in a traditional integrated assessment model, produce scenarios with what we're calling a CTBO scenario, carbon take-back obligation scenario, where the future trajectory of production and CCS deployment is governed by some enforced relationship for the rate of CCS deployment based on the amount of CO2 you produce, which then you back compute the carbon price and that. So you're impacting the system in a slightly different way. And in the same way, you could do it in an integrated assessment model, but you're talking a much more computationally expensive experiment. And when you can get the kind of general ensemble response from a simple model like this. So I think that's it. I'll just conclude really quickly. So I hope I've shown that we can successfully capture the behavior exhibited in integrated assessment models in a global sense. We've produced emulations of the relationship between the global carbon price and CO2 production, CO2 storage, and CO2 emissions time series in a range of models. We can use that emulator then to produce a DICE-like model and explore social cost of carbon estimates. And we can also do kind of interesting studies around that, which would take quite a big effort with integrated assessment models. And but on the other hand, you'd also struggle to complete with empirical equation sets. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Stuart. So those of you that thought that IAM were safe from being superseded by emulators, now you know you're not safe. So I would like to go back to the original idea of just taking clarifying questions for now and then waiting for the next two talks to go and have a discussion about this block afterwards, assuming, Stuart, that you can stay online.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So is there some... Yes, we have at least one.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. Volker Krey from IIASA here. One clarifying question regarding your sampling of the integrated assessment runs. I understand you're using mostly the C1 through C7 categorization with the climate outcomes from AR6. Are you using any other scenario design criteria in this selection, or are you treating them in other dimensions like policy design and so on the same?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of the kind of the fitting to a range of integrated assessment models behaviors, there are some kind of niche scenarios which are constrained in terms of their kind of design philosophy, right? And we try in general to exclude those. So we're trying, as a first guess, we were using, as a very first guess back in late 2019 when we were starting to think about this, we just used the SSP2, plain SSP2 scenario runs from each integrated assessment model as a first fit, on the basis that this was a middle-of-the-road SSP and it had no kind of other assumptions as to the development pathway other than a standard one that most integrated assessment model groups were running. We have expanded beyond SSP2 to the other SSPs, and you find a range of success in modeling those, and then as you go even more niche into the kind of more technology specific development pathway kind of assumption scenarios, you get less and less success, I'd say, as you go through. So of course the equations that I showed you was extremely simplified and very much made to capture the broad brush global relationship that these models derive between carbon price and abatement rates and CO2 storage deployment. And a scenario which assumes, say, particularly ambitious CCS deployment might well have very different assumptions to what we're capturing in our kind of broad brush equation set. But so to answer your question, kind of, but we've tried to stick to the middle group of scenarios as opposed to look at the kind of more niche technology specific assumptions.
Okay, thank you. We go on now to Chris Smith, and hopefully your presentation will be available. If not, you'll have to tell us about it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Okay, great. So, yep, good morning, everybody. So, I'm going to talk about FAIR. I'm going to talk about an in-development version of FAIR, version 2.1. And so FAIR is a reduced complexity climate model for scenario evaluation and integrated assessment. So let's see if this works. Here we go. Okay, so the philosophy of FAIR really is to be the sort of simplest possible emulator that can give a reasonably good physical representation of the climate system. So we start usually with emissions of CO2 other greenhouse gases as short-lived climate forces, but we can also run concentration-driven with greenhouse gases or forcing-driven with particular radiative forcings. And with this version of FAIR, we can also mix and match which components we want to run emissions, concentration, or forcing-driven. So for example, if you want to emulate one of the ESM CMIP6 runs, which are CO2 emissions-driven, but concentration-driven for other greenhouse gases, we can do that in this version of FAIR. And we have mechanisms for the carbon cycle, methane lifetime, ozone aerosol forcing. Some of these features are sort of newly implemented in the 2.1 version that are new or improved relative to previous versions. So version 1.6 is what was used in AR6 for Working Group 1 and Working Group 3. Nick and Stuart, who you've just heard from, did extensive work on version 2. And 2.1 is just really building on the work that Nick, Stuart, and others have done in really sort of simplifying and making more efficient the FAIR emulator. So a couple of new things as well is we can now implement stochastic internal variability in our results. And we also have a representation of the Earth's energy imbalance and ocean heat content. And this is useful for further constraining our results. And we can use it for applications such as estimating sea level rise from the emulations. So really quickly, just showing some aspects of FAIR. So we have a state-dependent carbon cycle. It's performed by, we have a 4-box atmospheric decay model, and we scale the lifetime based on the airborne fraction of CO2. So this is basically how much CO2 remains in the atmosphere for a pulse emission over 100 years. And we replicate the behavior of C4 MIP models, and Zeke's already showed this a little bit, based on how these carbon cycle feedbacks behave over time. And these two figures here show you the FAIR emulations for SSP 5.8.5 on the left and SSP 1.1.9 on the right. These are the colored curves, and in the black we have the prescribed concentrations that Magic derived, which were used for running CMIP6 models in Earth system models. And you can see that there's a wide variety, as sort of Zeke's already talked about, for the carbon cycle feedbacks for SSP 5.8.5, but most of that variation sort of kicks in beyond 2100. So the temperature and the carbon is actually making quite a large difference in the atmospheric CO2 long term. Whereas you can see for the SSP 1.1.9, the range of model calibrations is much smaller, and the prescribed concentrations lie within that range in most cases. I should say as well, this is not actually what we use for running the sort of large ensembles. These are just showing model-specific calibrations from C4 MIP. We have a new interactive methane lifetime, and this is calibrated again on CMIP6 models. We use AirChem MIP, which is the aerosol chemistry MIP. And we have 4 models from AirChem MIP, which gave us all of the model experiments that we needed in order to calibrate the methane lifetime. So the plot on the left shows you our calibrations to the 4 CMIP6 models between 1750 and 2500. For SSP 3.7.0, and you can see there's a wide variation over time in what's FAIR emulating for the methane lifetime in each model. When we apply this to concentration-driven runs for methane in the middle plot, again you can see that there's some variation between the 4 model calibrations from AirChem MIP. The black line here shows you the SSP 3.7.0 prescribed concentration run that Magic derived, and our model calibrations are sort of spanning that range. But what we do in order to fit the methane emissions to the concentrations is we take these calibrations from the 4 AirChem MIP models, and we sort of, within the range of our calibrations, we fit the historical concentrations to the emissions. And this is this figure on the right. So we're showing here that we can sort of emulate the historical methane concentrations to a very good level of accuracy just by searching within that parameter space from 4 CMIP6 models. Air results on ozone have also been improved from previously. I won't talk about too much about this, but the bottom row here shows how we can sort of fit a 3-parameter model to aerosol indirect forcing. So this the gray lines here show you model derived results from CMIP6 for 11 models, and the colored lines are the emulation used in FAIR based on emissions of sulfur, black carbon, organic carbon. And again, we're using AirChem MIP results on this, so this is all sort of derived from CMIP6. We have similar results for the ozone forcing, including ozone temperature feedbacks on ozone formation. And what we basically do, we sort of take all of these components of what I call the atmospheric model, and we couple this to an n-layer energy balance model. So this is quite a sort of well-known representation of the climate system. It uses a discrete number of ocean layers, and it models the heat transfer throughout, the time-dependent heat transfer throughout time as a response to forcing. We can write this equation in matrix form, and we can perform a matrix eigenvalue decomposition on this, and we can write this in terms of an impulse response function. So this is basically for this n equals 3 example, we can write this as a combination of 3 time constants, and that tells you basically the characteristic timescales of temperature response to a forcing. From this as well, we can also diagnose the equilibrium climate sensitivity and the transient climate response from this energy balance formulation. And the nice thing about this is that it's easily calibrated to CMIP6 results. And what we do for this is we use abrupt 4 times CO2 model results to calibrate this energy balance model. And this slide shows how the 4 times CO2 runs look when they're running fair. So the left plot shows a 1,000-year abrupt 4 times CO2 run for 49 CMIP6 models. This also includes that optional internal variability, and the internal variability is also taken from the 4 times CO2 run. So effectively, we're emulating what internal variability is in each CMIP6 model. And you can see there's a wide range of responses to 4 times CO2, as we expect, as we see in the CMIP6 archive. And the right plot shows the plot's regressions on the x-axis for each of these models of temperature versus top of atmosphere energy imbalance on the y-axis. So anybody who's familiar with the climate feedback literature will recognize these as so-called Gregory plots. And if you sort of squint, you can also see the curvature in this response over time. So this is what FAIR is capturing that increase in climate sensitivity with increasing temperature that we see in most CMIP6 models. So what we want to do really is take all of these calibrations to each of the Earth system components and put them all together. And we want to create a large ensemble that we go from emissions to forcing and then through to climate response. We also want to combine these samples to create distributions of plausible climate models, including those that don't exist in the CMIP6 space. So UK ESM is a great example. They have done all of the experiments we need to tune each parameter, but there's no point just emulating UK ESM because we can just run UK ESM. What we want to do is effectively span that whole uncertainty space, again, kind of what Zeke was talking about in terms of the uncertainty in all of these parameters. So here's an example where we actually, this is a sort of, on the right here, we have a sort of a scatter plot of how the climate response parameters and their correlations correspond to each other. And we take a large sample of these. So we take sort of 1.5 million ensemble members in the example I'm going to show. And FAIR's very quick to run, so we tend to get 100 ensemble members per second on a laptop or a sort of a simple desktop. Obviously, you could throw HPC at this and get very, very quick model results. So we take the samples, we take the correlations between parameters, and we produce a large ensemble of possible climate outcomes. This here shows you from a 1.5 million member ensemble the first 1,000 on the left. And as you can see, we get results that span the range between sort of no warming in the present day and 4 degrees. And obviously, most of these simulated climates are nonsense. And this almost is a bit like the ESMs. If anybody sort of follow the literature, we know that not all of the ESMs are doing particularly well historically. So what we want to do is actually constrain this ensemble to only really keep those ensemble members that have reproduced reality. So I will speed up. Sure. Okay. So we can look at constraining. We can look at historical temperature. We can also bring assessments into those constraints. For example, the equilibrium climate sensitivity from CMIP6. And sort of we get sort of a constrained range on the right. I'm going to skip through these slides just to show you when we constrain on multiple parameters, what's the difference between sort of what we sort of come up with for a constrained projection on the left. So this is basically our final ensemble. And we get things such as the correlations between transient climate response and aerosol forcing that we expect. So I'm going to skip to the conclusions and I'd be very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Once again, maybe clarifying questions, but you were so clear that I think everybody has it. Okay, so let's go to the last presentation of this slot, Thomas, and then we will have time, unless Thomas takes it all, for discussion, and then we will accommodate Shruti in the last 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. I will present today the work on Pathfinder, which is a new emulator we developed with Thomas Gasser here in IIASA. And I will start first to why did we want to do this. So the idea and the concept was quite simple from the beginning, and we wanted to go like in the reverse way that what the IPCC most scenarios are built from, like socioeconomic and then emission scenarios, and going to the impacts and physical impacts of the scenarios. And we wanted to go from the impacts and come back to emission and land use scenarios. And this is what's in blue, what Pathfinder is already doing. And we can also couple it with economic models. So that was a work that was presented by Thomas with Dice yesterday. So basically, how does Pathfinder works? So it's a compilation of existing formulation. So we didn't invent anything. You can see all the reference here. It's focused on the carbon cycle with 3 different things. And we have some impact emulator to have sea level rise, ocean acidification, or permafrost. So the big strength of the model is it can be invertible and can run in different way. One of them, which is quite unusual, is to run it with atmospheric concentration and global temperature as inputs. Yeah, so how does it work? How does it work? So we do to calibrate the model and the parameters. So it's quite simple. It has like 21 variables and like 70 parameters. We have a prior estimate that comes from multimodal ensembles, and so basically SEMIP6. And we constrain our variables with 18 constraints that comes from historical observations or assessments. And so we get this joint distribution that is a mix between those historical constraints and the model's parameters. And actually, it works quite well. And so we have very good performance on the climates and on the temperatures. So here is a small table with comparison between Pathfinder and SEMIP6. And on the carbon cycle, we are too optimistic on high warming scenarios. So how can we use it? So I will go super quickly on this slide as it was presented yesterday. But basically, it's to estimate robust price, carbon price due to physical uncertainty. And the other example is actually the work of my PhD here, is to have this backward approach for large ensemble scenarios. And so as we said, like we run the model backwards with temperature and CO2 concentration, like 10,000 trajectories that are generated independently, and we have all those packages and give them to Pathfinder that back calculates global variables as CO2 emissions or non-CO2 radiative forcings. And we have this lot of packages that we need to analyze and to exploit. And so the first thing we do is, thanks to the impact emulator the few impact emulator we have in the model, we try to tighten the envelopes, basically. And by construction, we try to respect Paris Agreement, so under 2 degrees, no overshoot over 2 degrees, and going through 1.5 on the very long term. And you see that when you add impacts, more and more impacts, like the envelopes get tightened. And then the next step is from those pathways we can define some characteristics. So for example, the quantity of SRM or CGR, or the date when the emissions peak. And if you look at the evolution of the peak here, we just made peak later and later. You see that the envelope gets smaller and smaller. At some point, it disappears, so that's the size, and you have no more envelope. And that's what we call kind of a geophysical point of no return, meaning that after this date, it's no longer possible to follow. But this is for only one configuration and one set of parameters of Pathfinder, so you don't have any uncertainty on this. But if you reproduce it with a Monte Carlo in a lot of configuration, you get this physical uncertainty, and so you can define this point of no returns for different confidence level. And so those are the points after which it is no longer geophysically possible to reach our impact targets. And the confidence level means in how many set of parameters we can find this limit. So here for 50%, and you can do it for a wide range of pathway characteristics, so the quantity of geoengineering technologies available, when emission peaks, the date of net zero, or a wide range of actually like every pathway characteristic you could find relevant. So now the idea is to keep going on developing Pathfinder and there are several aspects we want to work on. And the first one is to make this relation and to go further in the loop directly from emission and land-use scenarios to kind of have a kind of estimate of the cost of these emissions and the socio-economical relevance of those pathways that remains, because for now we don't have any constraint on that. Another aspect we want to work on is to add more natural impacts, and if it's even better if we can easily link them to socioeconomic damages, and to find more of them. And the last, on the very long term, so far after my PhD, the idea would be like to close the loop and to have these socioeconomic damages linked with those socioeconomic scenarios and to have these kind of feedback loops. So on all these points, it's a lot of exploratory work, and we still have a lot thinking about it, so we're really open to any suggestions or discussions or collaboration with this. I don't know if I was quick, slow. So thank you for your time, and I will be happy to elaborate.
You were very quick. For those of you that were at the session about improving the scenario process yesterday, probably you were not, but Vanessa Schweitzer was presenting something about a communication device through reasons for concern, where this idea of determining these points of no return depending on the impact size that you are willing to take could be very relevant, so I need to introduce the two of you. Okay, questions for Thomas, and then we can open, clarifying questions for Thomas, and then we can open it to the larger discussion, and we have up to 15 minutes, thanks to your quick presentation. Alex.
Thanks, Alex Ruane from NASA GIS. I may be kind of leading into the larger discussion here, but I'm curious about that kind of last upper left step in your circle, which was, getting to the natural impacts. So I come from a community that does a lot of agricultural modeling from AgMIP, and it will be interesting to think more about how we can actually engage in something like Pathfinder, about to what level, can our emulators become a portion of your emulator, but likewise, how can we give feedback from our community about the kind of potential pitfalls in kind of aggregating up to large global scale impacts of incredibly diverse, system like agriculture. So maybe I'm asking too much detail, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on that last step. Thanks.
So Yeah, it's really a big challenge, and looking at those agricultural impacts, because we have really like a global model and very aggregated and simple, and it's not regionalized. And for agricultural impacts, like without regionalization, it's super hard. And yeah, I don't really have an answer to. I'm trying to think about it and to find answers, but for now I didn't find it, and it's. Yeah. Okay. With pleasure.
Now I'd like to open it for comments, questions, discussion points about this part of the session, and then we can go on to the other type of emulators. Anybody? I may start with one if nobody else has one, which is, I think, Ben Sanderson, who is, oh, okay, I'll give precedence to the audience. No. Can you see? Yeah, raise.
No, if I may, I wanted to have a follow-up question or discussion point on the IM emulator presentation, which I found interesting and probably a useful endeavor. From the response, from the clarifying question before, I wasn't so sure whether very different scenario designs, for example, so-called peak budget scenarios that basically aim at reaching neutrality at a given point in time versus full century budgets that essentially aim at a target, reaching a target by the end of the century, and therefore including also much more overshoot, whether those have been, for example, separated in the emulator parameterization, which I think would be essential, otherwise you can get results all over the place. And then the second point, which I understand is actually also quite commonly done in simple climate models, we see a very strong model footprint in carbon price outcomes that relate to a single climate target in integrated assessment models. So typically, and I think you could see it from the slides that were up, the carbon price span essentially 2 orders of magnitude for reaching a given climate target. So I could find it could be interesting to look into emulating specific groups or even specific individual integrated assessment models to also be able to, you want to, look at a remind type of response or a message type of response or an image type of response to a certain climate emulation goal, to a certain, climate goal, and then, or the carbon price climate goal kind of correlation. So yeah, just as a suggestion in this context, which as I said, I think this would be quite similar to what the emulators on the climate system do.
Stuart, do you have a reply to that? Can we put up the Zoom participants? We're playing with technology. Oh, here he is.
Okay. In terms of the peak budget versus end of century budget kind of discussion, we can separate those out in the kind of tuning parameters, and you do see a separation there, mainly because the production in a peak budget, the requirements for kind of peak for CO2 production reductions and CO2 emissions reductions are stricter, essentially, by mid-century. So you do see a separation between kind of those two category of scenarios. I more meant in my kind of earlier comments, the kind of technology-specific scenario design pathways that the kind of technology niches and socioeconomic niches that some of the kind of scenarios explore that we haven't really looked at. If I'm honest, so far we've excluded those kind of niches and looked at bulk
like middle ground scenarios on the basis that if we can't emulate those, then we definitely should be able to emulate the more niche scenarios that require, in theory, kind of more parameterization within our framework, I'd say. So we've stuck to the more middle of the road scenarios in general, but we do see a separation in terms of if a scenario is categorized as peak budget constrained or end of century constrained, that's possible to separate. And then the second comment was on, I agree in terms of the usefulness of comparing between integrated assessment models, particularly when they have such a broad range of perceived carbon prices required, say, in 2050 to achieve a given level of mitigation. It's extremely broad across models. But I think a lot of the use of an emulator is in understanding from a very simplistic, minimal parameterization kind of viewpoint, what is the kind of assumed, what set of parameters is assumed to generate the type of outputs that, say, an image model can generate versus a message model. And you can do that in an emulator sense. And also, as you said, yes, the kind of, if nothing else, the kind of comparisons of what does a low ambition, medium ambition, and high ambition mitigation scenario look like within a particular mitigation scenario, and how do the parameter sets vary within a particular integrated assessment model, are all kind of useful questions, even if comparisons across the whole range of models in one go isn't particularly insightful, as you say.
Thank you. Where is the microphone? I have, oh yeah. So first Carl and then Max.
Yeah, thanks, Carl Schleusner, Climate Analytics. Great presentations. I have a question to several presenters, and it goes a little bit into the basically questions of applying emulators in different contexts. So the first is, I mean, and it takes us outside of what emulators are built for, because by definition, we would say emulators are for emulating things within the calibrated range. Unfortunately, as always, some of the biggest questions we have out there are outside our calibrated range. And one that we definitely would want to understand a little bit better, or at least kind of understand the range of possible outcomes involved, is questions around a zero emissions commitment, and then next step, impacts or reversibility under overshoot scenarios. And I mean, Tomas, your work goes a little bit in this direction. I mean, at least on the global scale, you do have, you know, a handle on those questions. And you know, with FAIR and other emulators, we try to go there and explore this. But of course, there are pitfalls in terms of that we do not have sufficient amount of ESM scenarios to calibrate against, and then we also don't necessarily have good reason to believe them if we had them. So I would be very interested in, you know, from several speakers, or, you know, if you had some ideas about the potential and pitfalls, but also ideas about what a research agenda would look like that utilizes emulators to tackle some of those questions.
All right. Who wants to start? Chris? Microphone, please. Or Rana up here if you want.
Yes, thank you, Carl. Very good question. So yes, we are a little bit constrained by the Earth system model results we have to calibrate a model like FAIR on. We could certainly make more use of, for example, CDR-MIP type experiments where we have removals of CO2 from the atmosphere, and to determine whether there is any difference in the responses to those kind of scenarios. But I think also this comes a little bit into MIP design. Ben Sanderson was making the case yesterday that we sort of need more sort of overshoot scenarios, sort of more scenarios that are kind of more realistically following what we sort of see in some of the IAM databases, and the kind of Paris-compatible type of scenarios that that we sort of hope to see in reality, and we don't have too many of those to go on to calibrate our emulators. So I wouldn't want to sort of make sort of conclusions based on things we haven't calibrated on. Also, yeah, we can sort of come up with different experiments that we don't have in, say, CMIP archives to answer some of those questions.
Thank you. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll go to Max and his question, and then we can pick some of these up maybe later if they are still burning in your mind.
Right. So Max Tavoni from European Institute on Economics and the Environment. So I have a question, and it is about IAM emulators, but I think it's more general about the other ones. And of course, emulators depend on the underlying data on which they are built upon. And this was a discussion which I think came up also for the air system emulators, and whether the CMIP6 actually was designed for that purpose, and it was not. And the same here is for AR6 IAM as scenarios, and it's rich, it's big, it has a lot of different models, although there are a lot of redundancies, and we had presentations on the first day by Chris and others on also how to look into these redundancies, but mostly they were not built for emulators. And although it's true that some of the models assume exponential growth in carbon pricing, many didn't. And maybe it looks like this in the outcome, but they were not designed like this. And then the more we go to more policy scenarios which are as more policy realism, and I think also in the discussion about yesterday where we should go, there's a clear demand of scenarios and that are more realistic on the policy front. And on policy front, what we see is that carbon prices, for example, plays a role, but a relatively minor role, just one of the many policy tools that policymakers are using to reduce emissions. And this is already in the scenarios where that employ a variety of subsidies, regulatory approaches, carbon pricing and market-based solutions as well, but many more than those. The more we go into that direction, the more this policy realism will become large, and then the more difficult it will become to find relatively simple relations like the one that we saw before. But we need to go there as well. And maybe that when we think about the scenario design and the policy realism, then we should also think, and this is more of a comment, I guess, I don't know if we can learn something from the system model community, about how to design experiments that then can be used eventually also to build emulators which are robust.
Thank you. I see that as a comment rather than a question, because I think...
Emulators or other communities, yes.
Oh, okay. We need to pretty soon switch to Shruti talk. So maybe you had a question. Do you think you could do it in a minute? Oh, okay, later. Okay, so Shruti, why don't you come up and we do your talk? And then, so this starts the next session, well, part of the session about emulators for climate impacts. Thank you for the nice discussion so far, and thank you to the first 4 speakers. Thank you to those online. If they want to leave now, they probably can. And Shruti, please go ahead. Yeah, it's up.
Yeah, great. Okay, so that was very interesting discussions, and thank you for accommodating me a bit earlier. Yeah, I'll be presenting a bit of a stretch from what we've been seeing so far, and I'll be talking about integrating land cover, land management feedbacks into Earth system models using an emulator approach. Does this work? Ooh. Not sure if this should work now? Oh yeah, now it works. So just to motivate why I'm generally pursuing sort of an emulator approach in representing these feedbacks, here you can see a figure from the IPCC land report that was also at Pop et al., where you can see the different sort of land cover scenarios that would play out under different sustainability scenarios. And you can see that they diverge quite a bit. There's quite a bit of range of uncertainty. And in essence also, there is a growing demand for smarter land use or more informed land cover decisions. To explore these, though, you would need several climate model runs. I think we all here understand how difficult that is and how computationally heavy that is. And that's where the emulators would come in, because the main sort of motivation here is to be able to explore these pathways, but in a more computationally cheap manner, using what we already know from existing Earth system model runs. And this would, in essence, also provide agility in exploring these different land cover scenarios, as well as how they evolve with changing climate. The framework for emulating the effects of land cover, here I mainly focus on tree cover first, would look as follows. So we would use a monthly emulator, so it would be month-specific. And the first variable that we try to emulate is the one that has the most physical response to changes in tree cover, which is the surface temperature. We use a generalized additive model to do this, and the main reason here being it has a non-prescribed functional form, so it fits a spline, which is quite flexible in the shape of the response it can depict, and it's also good at multidimensional data. In this case, you can see that we want to actually train for each grid point what the expected response of surface temperature would be to a given change in tree cover at that grid point. And you can see that also these responses are quite regional dependent, as you can see in the map there, where you can see the response from full afforestation and CSM. And that's why we also use the GAM, because it allows us to decompose these multidimensional data without any prescribed functional form. The training material for this GAM, or this emulator, is dedicated Earth system model runs that explore the effects of full afforestation as well as full expansion of cropland, so extreme deforestation. We also look at observational data that maps the potential effects on surface temperature from deforestation as sort of like a reference observational data set point. And this also allows us to sort of interpolate, so we have the extreme ends of what you would expect, and it allows us to sort of then use the emulator to look within the calibration space. When evaluating the emulator, there are two things that we generally desire for its future performance, which is that we can actually use it for different or changing background climates, as well as use it across different ranges of tree cover change, which would then allow us to extrapolate across different scenarios. Unfortunately, for this, we only have the ESM dedicated experiments or the observational data. So in essence, the evaluation is a bit more tricky here, just because we don't really have much to justify the emulator's performance with. And so for this, I used a block cross-validation method. And this entails that you sort of look at continuous geographical areas, and this takes into account spatial cross-correlations. And then you also cluster these areas according to their different background climate. For instance, when we want to look at the emulator's performance across different background climates. And in this way, you would get a block that you would take out and train the emulator on the rest of the material, and then you would be able to validate it on this and sort of, in that way, have a representative performance test of the emulator on out-of-sample material that you know also has different background climate, as well as isn't really having spatial correlations that the emulator could sort of, cheat with. Some of the example evaluation results over here. In general, this is just preliminary testing, and this is just showcasing a framework of how to do this, but you can see that the emulator is able to reasonably predict well across background climates as well as tree cover change, with the median root mean squared errors as shown on the y-axis being close to or less than 1. Here I'm showing it for observations and CSM, and the left panel shows the prediction of the emulator across background climates, and the right panel across tree cover changes. And I'm only showing it for North America and South America in this case, but we've done the evaluation for other areas also. You can see that observations have quite high errors, but this is mainly due to data sparsity, again, like speaking for more better spatial coverage when training such an emulator. You can also see that the performance for afforestation is less limited by background climate as compared to deforestation. So that's what you can see on the left panel, where afforestation, which is the blue box plots, have in general a lower root mean squared error compared to deforestation for both January and July, which is hatched. And this is mainly because you can imagine that deforestation is much more nonlinear, especially depending on which background climate it is at, as compared to afforestation. And that's, in general, something that we would expect in terms of out-of-sample predictions. When we look at the emulator performance across different tree fraction changes, you can see there's a general U-shape. And this basically, again, speaks for, okay, we need to have the extreme ends of the tree cover response, so the extreme ends of change, so that we can actually interpolate in between. Otherwise, the emulator isn't so sure what's going on. And also, towards these extreme ends, you can experience more nonlinear response, so it's quite important to capture that. From the evaluation, though, it was quite obvious that given a spatially complete data set that captures the extreme ends of the response, the emulator is able to reasonably predict, since it anyway just interpolates. This still doesn't take away the uncertainty that we have in the shape of the tree cover response, however, due to the limited training or validation material. And so when we actually do use these emulators to provide relevant outputs, what we actually do is sample the range of responses that takes into account the uncertainty or the complexity in the shape of response that our emulator uses. And this is what we call sensitivities. So instead of actually getting a deterministic temperature change, we actually look at the sensitivities in the temperature to changes in tree cover. And then again, when we actually want to have relevant outputs, another thing is to not just have surface temperature, but have 2-meter temperature. However, we don't take this directly from the Earth system models, since the 2-meter temperature is diagnosed quite differently between models and also does not really fit to the observationally defined 2-meter temperature. So it can be at different levels in Earth system models as compared to the observations. So actually, when we look at 2-meter temperature, we simply just use our surface temperature and diagnose it using observationally derived relationships. And that's, in the end, how we derive relevant outputs from this emulator that we've sort of validated to then inform the sensitivities of the 2-meter temperature response that would then be relevant to impact assessments. Some of the example outputs of the emulator can be seen here. For different SSPs, and here I'm showing it for the emulator calibrated in the community Earth system model. You can see the responses under SSP 1.2.6 and SSP 3.7.0 for afforestation, which is in blue, and deforestation in red, where June and July are differentiated as solid lines and dotted lines. The distributions do differ per geographical region. And here I only show geographical regions where significant tree cover change occurs, so more than 15% for more than 30 grid points. You can see in general that actually when we evaluate the sensitivities of 2-meter temperature response to tree cover change, the response that's within the SSPs is actually quite skewed, especially for the month of July. And that basically just suggests that when we look at the uncertainties within the shape of the force response, there is in general some sort of skewness within that. And that's also quite a relevant output, since it speaks for how changes in tree cover can have regional impacts, especially on extreme events. So that was quite an interesting finding from this little emulator that's been developed so far. Yeah, and the other planned developments would then be to extend it to other land management practices such as irrigation, as well as look at effects on other variables such as relative humidity, which would then provide indices such as wet bulb globe temperature and also the effects of tree cover change, therefore, on labor productivity, for instance. So here's a visual sneak peek that I will leave everyone with of what the temperature emulator does look like. On the x-axis, you can see the range of tree fraction changes, and on the y-axis is the latitudinal bands. The color bar indicates the emulated surface temperature response, and it's showing for each month. Yeah, thank you for listening. I look forward to feedback. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Questions for Shruti, because she needs to leave at, after this, so it's your only chance. If not, I have a couple myself. Chris, you have some?
Yeah, I don't want to hog the floor, but very good, very interesting, Shruti. I was wondering, is it possible to sort of go from this this emulator to estimates of, say, AFLU CO2 emissions or radiative forcing from the land cover change?
Yeah, so in this case, we mainly look at the local temperature response, and that's biogeophysically forced, so mainly forced via, I guess, changes in albedo. We don't really consider the carbon cycle response in this case. Yeah, so I would say that the relevant output of this emulator currently would be just the surface temperature responses. That's the most regional sort of, yeah, regionally relevant response from changes in tree cover. But of course, I mean, those kind of other parameters could definitely be considered. Yeah.
Anybody else? I was curious, Shruti, about the intermodal variation for this response, because you are setting yourself up with a tough test, which is, you know, within one model, can I have a low root mean square error? But I can imagine that if you compare the behavior of different ESMs, that kind of sensitivity may be all over the place. Did you look at that at all, or?
Yeah, so we do consider CSM, EC Earth, and MPI ESM. Between CSM and MPI ESM, there is not much difference in the surface temperature. Again, like here, the surface temperature is the most physically consistent variable. If you go to 2-meter temperature, given the difference in diagnosis schemes, it can differ, and that's why we choose to emulate it. So there is consistency there in both the magnitude, although that's a bit different sometimes, but definitely in the sign of response there is. With EC Earth, there was a bit of an issue because they kept their dynamic vegetation on, which is not the case in the other ESMs. So then the response was a bit different. But again, here with the emulator, what we mainly do is try and just be like the ESM without judging its realism. So yeah, there was some intermodal differences, but this was something to just not consider too much.
Yes?
A question from...
Oh.
Yes.
Okay. How do we do this?
I can just... So someone from online is asking if, still writing, if this relationship, temperature tree cover, is modulated by the type of ecosystem. And, okay, this question. Thank you.
Right. I mean, this is actually quite an interesting question, because I actually had checked the difference when you include the different types of tree fractions, so like needle leaf, broadleaf, evergreen, deciduous. It didn't really impact the temperature response or add much value in terms of the performance. So to like put it in a more simple manner in terms of statistical representation, it doesn't make a difference. I would say that it probably does when you look more in a finer spatial resolution. But yeah, since we're more coarse, it didn't really make so much of a difference. And when we evaluated across background climate performances, of course, you can see that some areas just in general didn't have such a good performance depending on the Earth system models. So South America or Africa had a different range of root mean squared errors compared to Europe. And that again might be due to the ecosystem. But yeah, in terms of our spatial resolution and general statistical approach, it didn't make too much of a difference.
If there is no other question, we can actually break in time for refreshments, and I implore you to come back at 11, because we just have a half an hour with, 45 minutes actually, not the entire time slot, so we need to fit 3 more presentations. I'm actually talking last, so I don't want to be left with just a couple of minutes. And thank you for your attendance and questions, and I'll see you soon. And thank you to our speakers. related to emulators of climate information for impacts modeling. And the first one is by Chris Wells, who maybe is still having a break. So he was here a second ago? Okay, I'll count to 10, and if he's not here, we go with Jan. Is that? No. Where is he? What's more important than this? Yeah, would we be able to switch to the next? Jan, would you mind? Oh, all right. We are waiting for you. No pressure. Come up. I think your presentation is up.
Apologies.
Are you ready? Do you need a minute to collect? No. Okay, thank you. So we start with Chris, and we go from there.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone. That's a really interesting first session. So really happy to be kicking off the second session. Yeah, I'm Chris. I'm a postdoc at the University of Leeds, and I've been looking at some of these some kind of pattern scaling approaches to climate emulation. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit and give a little bit of motivation and kind of justification for what we're looking at. As we've heard over the last couple of days, there's this kind of tension or kind of problem to be answered in terms of what scenarios we can use out of the subset, generating a subset from, for example, the SSPs to use in something like scenario MIP, because it takes a huge amount of computing power to run these spatially resolved Earth system models and to generate those spatially resolved outputs. And so the kind of challenge is, can we have a more computationally efficient way of generating spatial patterns in these scenarios? And as people have talked about before, these emulators are a key kind of tool for doing this. So I've got on here some of the global mean temperature projections from these global mean emulators for some of the working group 3 scenarios. And of course, a challenge then is, can we say something about the spatial patterns of these? And so there's tools that have been developed for these using different techniques, and one which I'm using today is this MESMER modular system model emulator, regional applications, which has been developed. And I'm looking at looking at the mean response. So they look at things like internal variability, but I'm interested initially in applying the mean response. And in particular, the technique that's used for this is this concept called pattern scaling, where you assume that the spatial pattern of for example, warming, but of any variable, is constant as you apply a forcing to the scenario. And this then, so you can then scale that pattern by the global mean temperature response to approximate the pattern that you would get under a different scenario or a different level of warming. And of course, this is an approximation because of this completely accurately represented Earth system models. We would just use that instead. But the question is, how much of a limitation is it? And under what conditions is it a significant problem? So there was quite a bit of work done on understanding pattern scaling a few years ago, and a lot of conclusions drawn from them, particularly using the RCP scenarios. People were kind of pointing out that it was quite good for the RCPs because you had, for example, aerosols going down in their emissions quite early on into the future in all the scenarios, and so you didn't have a very spatially, a variation in the spatial forcing between different scenarios, which you would have if you have different aerosol emissions pathways in different regions in particular. So it was good because it was mostly dominated by greenhouse gas forcing, which the pattern is more consistent for, because it's a more kind of well-mixed species. And also when it comes to climate stabilization, it's been pointed out that for scenarios like, say, SSP 585 or kind of 3.7 scenario, where you have warming throughout the century, the climate is in a similar state of disequilibrium as you go through that scenario. And so any, so if you had kind of variations in the climate between equilibrium and this transient warming, which we know is the case, then this won't be such a big problem if you have these high emission scenarios or with a kind of relatively constant warming rate. Whereas if you have a stabilization scenario, this can cause difficulties. And of course, something which you can probably tell emerging from that is that the SSPs have a lot more of these kind of characteristics than the RCPs did. A lot more spatial variation in aerosol forcing and other kind of forcings, and also stabilization scenarios which peak and then decline again. So with differing levels of equilibrium across the set of scenarios. So do I just press? Yes, cool. So what I've done just to start with, just on this initial slide, is looking at how pattern scaling works for single forcer runs. So you have these DA-MIP single force runs I've just used here. So we're just using the greenhouse gas historical runs. This is showing that point that I was making about how if you have a single forcer, it can be good. And if you apply the pattern to the same data that you use to create the pattern, then of course it works well as well. So in this case, on the top, on the left, I've got the temperature over the last 30 years from the greenhouse gas scenario. And then beneath that is the emulation error. So that's the emulator minus the ESM. So that's the effect that you would expect from pattern scaling minus the actual Earth system model response, which is on the top. And as you can see, the errors are small and quite spatially homogeneous because of this sort of less of a time dependence on the forcing response and less spatial variation through time. And on the right, I've done the same thing for precipitation, which is not the focus of this talk, but just to show you can apply this to different variables. So it's still trained on the global mean temperature, but you're looking at then the precipitation change per unit temperature change in each location and using that pattern. And you can see you get problems where, for example, the ITCZ in the tropics and associated changes with that, but it's generally quite good. But of course, we don't want to just do a self-emulation because by definition, we have the Earth system model data for that. Ultimately, we want to apply this to scenarios which we haven't run in the Earth system models and which we don't want to because there's far too many of them to do it. But of course, the way we can test it is by training it on some scenarios we've run the Earth system models for and then using it to project other scenarios we've also run the Earth system models for and comparing them to see how well it works at going out of sample. And so that's the kind of the black bullet point. And the red bullet points are kind of the future questions. This is very much like initial kind of steps. So, of course, one thing to consider is if we have these errors, how large are they compared to other sources of error, model spread, natural variability, very important to quantify that. And then also how important are these errors in terms of climate risks and impacts associated with that. And so I'll just explain what I've done in this diagram. So I talked about how you can train the model on one scenario. So you take the pattern of warming from one scenario and you can apply it to predict another scenario. And so in this case, I've taken 5 SSP scenarios, so it's kind of the tier 1 scenarios plus the SSP 119, some more kind of Paris relevant, more stabilization scenario. And I've done the 25 pairwise projections, so using one scenario to generate the pattern and then projecting a different scenario. And so starting in the top left corner is using SSP 119 to target SSP 119. Then going along the top is increasing the radiative forcing of the target scenario, so increasing through those scenarios for the target scenario, so the thing we're trying to project. And then going down the columns is, down the row, sorry, is changing the predictor, so changing the pattern that we're using to do it. So that means that this diagonal then, the kind of 5 combinations here, is using the same scenario to project itself. So this is the self-emulation again, as I showed earlier. But in this case, it's for each of those 5 SSP things. And as you can see, these have the smaller errors associated with this, and that's because the spatial pattern, by definition, is not varying as much between them. So you still have variation through time. So this is the error, the emulator error towards the end of the century, once these have diverged, the scenarios have diverged in their kind of responses. But the self-emulation is still generating, as you can tell, these relatively small errors. And so then if we kind of go to the top right of the graph, that represents what we can call extrapolation. So this is using one scenario to target a scenario with a larger radiative forcing. And as you go towards the top right corner, then you get more extrapolations. The top right is, of course, using 119 to target SSP 585. Yeah, sorry, the bar is from -0.5 to 0.5 a degree of warming. Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that. But the relative size is clear from the colours, but the scale goes from -0.5 a degree to 0.5 a degree. So you're talking now about changes up to maybe 0.5 a degree or more of errors spatially between these, and interestingly, kind of consistent patterns between some of them. And then conversely, if you go to the bottom left corner, This is then interpolation, so using a scenario to project a scenario with a lower radiative forcing. And again, you get some errors associated with that, more than you get for self-emulation, but less than for the extrapolation scenarios. And so then the kind of final thing which I want to kind of just discuss and bring up is some of the effects that you can have from spatial variations, particularly in these stabilization scenarios, because this is something which, as I tried to emphasize earlier, is going to be important in the future, these stabilization scenarios. And so if you think about what you're doing with pattern scaling, you're taking this coefficient of the local warming per global warming at each location, and you just multiply that by the global time series. And so by definition, at every location, your time series is going to be the same shape as the global time series. It's just going to be a factor different, right? But the shape is the same. And so crucially, if you have a scenario with a peak in the warming, then your projection is going to peak at the same time in every location. It's going to peak in every location at the same as the global mean peak, just because it follows that shape. But of course, if you have spatial variation in the warming year in the Earth system model data, that means this is all going to be missed, essentially. And so what I've got on the bottom here is for SSP 119, this map is showing the year in which you have peak warming in the smoothed time series. And as you can see, there is a spatial structure here. And all the spatial structure will be missed if you're just using pattern scaling for that mean response. So for example, you've got kind of the Southern Ocean peaking later, presumably because you have inertia with that, and the land slightly earlier because that warms earlier and then it peaks earlier when you have a stabilization scenario. And on the top, just an example, I've got one model, ECR3, where I'm showing that. And so you do get intermodal variation, which is partly smoothed out by the average across. There's 8 models for the bottom graph. And then this time series plot is showing in the solid line is the global temperature time series for that model in the Arctic, and with the smoothed and the annual data. And the dashed line is showing the actual Arctic response. And as you can see, those shapes are different, which is not what you'd expect from the pattern scaling, or not what you would take into account with the pattern scaling. And in particular, you have several decades towards the end of the century where the Arctic peaks in 2100, hence the dark red on the map, but the globe peaks around mid-century. And so the key thing which I want to kind of flag there is that for those last few decades, if you're using the pattern scaling, then you're pegging it to the global response, which is showing a cooling. So you would project a relative cooling in the Arctic, or a peak and then a cooling, whereas the actual Earth system model is projecting an increase in the warming pattern in that time series, and you're going to miss that completely. So just some conclusions from that then, just to kind of wrap up. Pattern scaling works in certain circumstances, but it's made worse by, for example, interpolation and especially extrapolation from the predictor to your target. So it's maybe not the best, it's not optimal necessarily to use just the full set of the scenarios, or use one to predict another when there's a large radiative forcing. It's affected by this spatial variation in the peak warming gear, and also spatial variation in the forces, which I haven't sort of explored in my results here, but it's something which is going to be also, I would argue, important in future scenarios. And so then the idea of my work is to generate a set of recommendations for use of pattern scaling. This is work in progress, but we can say straight away just from the plots that I've shown that you have to be careful of the choice of the predictor scenarios, especially with different warming rates. And you can take care in areas, particularly areas which you think for physical reasons will be affected by different peak warming times, like maybe the oceans or the land, and you can think of other examples. And so in terms of future work, like I mentioned, looking at the errors compared to internal variability, how important these errors are in terms of impact analyses, and can we address some of these? There's some interesting work in the literature about potentially taking some of these things into account, which I'd like to expand on, and then ultimately using these to generate some best estimate near-term projections. And so my final slide is just some kind of implications for kind of the IPCC community generally, which I'd like to highlight, which is across the different working groups. So in working group 1, of course, as has been discussed and as part of this presentation, is about, it'd be good to kind of improve these techniques, and there's lots of work about adding predictors alongside global temperature, which maybe could help mitigate some of these issues which I've highlighted here, and quantifying the errors. In working group 2, as has been discussed extensively throughout the conference, looking at how this can affect impact and risk estimates, and translating those errors in projection into impacts. And working group 3, as was done so successfully throughout AR6, applying the emulators across the scenarios, kind of extending that to spatially resolved as well in kind of a systematic way. So Thank you very much, and yeah, happy to take any questions or hear any feedback. Thanks.
Thank you. I propose to do like before, just clarifying questions and then a little discussion at the end. You mean the one online? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I can read it. I think it's Sonia actually asking which version of Mesmer was used in this study.
So I was using the version which is available on the GitHub, but I just took out the mean warming version. So it's not using any of the extra models, it's just the mean response. Okay. So basically, I'm just using Mesmer as a useful tool for implementing pattern scaling in the mean response. Yeah, but the results would be the same if you kind of just implemented pattern scaling generally, I think.
Okay, thank you. And this is my curiosity. Did you find any special behavior under SSP 3.7 for pattern scaling, or does it behave as the other ones? Because that's supposed to have more, local forcings.
Yeah, so I've done some investigations looking at the difference between SSP 370 and then 370 low NTCF, because that, of course, is scenarios with two very different aerosol patterns, which I'm looking at using to tease out some of the differences in aerosols. And you see the expected things you might expect from differences in aerosols between these scenarios.
Okay.
And so, for example, I didn't show, but with the historical greenhouse gas scenario, you can also use the historical aerosol scenario and look at kind of self-emulation and cross-emulation from that, and you see exactly what you'd expect, which is in the aerosol case, the northern hemisphere is more sensitive to the global warming because the aerosols are predominantly in the northern hemisphere historically. So when you emulate the greenhouse gas from that, you overestimate the warming there. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing for me is that because the global mean temperature is still the same, is that because you're overestimating the warming locally there because of that aerosol response locally, by definition, you have to underestimate the warming elsewhere. And that's not necessarily physically understandable just from looking at that location. You have to have a picture of the whole set of things that's going on just because of that fact that global mean is just the definition of the average of the regional ones. And I think you would see similar things in more complex scenarios like the SSP 370 for sure.
Thank you. Okay, now we go to Jan Kilkai that is going to talk about Mesmer X. And I feel like Mesmer is becoming like a car, luxury car that has all this version, Mesmer M, Mesmer X. So I guess Mesmer X is the best.
No, it's just for climatic streams.
Yeah, okay.
Could I have the slides, please? Yeah.
We need to load this next deck of slides, please.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for being there. And would it be possible to have the presenter view? Yeah. No, it's okay. It's just that I had some names that I've written, so I tried to remember. So, thank you very much for being there. It's Jan Kilkai, and I will talk, from ETH Zurich, I will talk about the emissions of climatic streams. So, sorry? Yep. So, most of you know why we are interested in climatic streams, basically because if you're looking at the economical losses from climatic streams, there is a change in the frequency and intensity of these extremes, leading to more economic losses. So, for instance, in 2017, there were losses through hurricanes and wildfires, droughts, and so on and so forth. So, it is becoming, without any bad wordplay, a hot topic. And we are trying to account for these climatic streams in the projections. So, for instance, what IPCC has shown is that in this burning ember plot, that will be, there's some echo, that will be an increasing reason for concern even for low warming scenario, like at 1.5 Celsius or 2 Celsius, it will already be a high risk. So we want to take that into account. So here, that's the moment where I'm talking about all the names that I've seen during the former presentations in Scenario Forum. And it is the former version of my slides. Okay. So in the IAMs, usually there are no climatic streams. or no climate impacts. What we have seen yesterday is that, for instance, Francesco Colelli was putting some climate impacts on the energy system in Which, and Adriano Vinca in Message, and Oliver Perkins in agent-based models, Nicola Ranger in catastrophe risk models. There is a growing interest for that, and we're going towards integration of the climate impacts and also the extremes, and that's good because we need that. To do so, we're trying to do emulators because system models are somewhat not, they just take too long to run. So we have simple climate models that provide us with global outputs. They're much faster, but the issue is that they're global. So we are trying to do, so we had this Mesmer, which is not only doing pattern scaling, also it accounts for natural variability. That's the whole interest of the model, trying to account for like moving from global temperature to local temperature, what are the possible futures, how it will change over time, taking into account the correlation in space and in time. We want to extend that to Mesmer X, where the X here stands for extremes. So we are emulating the local climate extremes to reproduce the distribution and also the spatial and temporal characteristics. For instance, Claudia Tebaldi did in 2020 an emulation for local climate extremes, and it was an excellent first point. And here we are also including the natural variability, the distribution of these extremes. The interest is that we want to couple that later to IAM so that we can have the full spectrum of impacts in the transformation pathways. For instance, how much would droughts impact the BECS, the bioenergies with carbon capture and storage, or fires impact afforestation that could affect the transformation pathways. So, yes, nope. Thanks. Nope. Okay, so how do I do so? I will show the results that we have for the annual maximum temperature. For instance, in IPCC IRSIC, we were seeing, and that we were seeing before, that there is a change, there is some correlation between the change in global temperature, that's what there is on the x-axis in the upper left plot, and the change in TX6. And what we want to do is to extend that, some scaling, to the local grid cells, plus to extend that to the distributions. For instance, the annual maximum temperature, it's what we call block maxima. Then we can approximate the distribution by generalized extreme value distribution, GEV. And we can try to see if the location scales linearly or more complex evolutions in the location, the scale, and the shape of the distribution. So I developed a general framework to try to fit the evolution of these parameters. And then using some statistical tools, we are training the correlations in space and in time. Then, and it's really fast, like to train on one system model, it takes us like 1 hour. So to emulate the climate extremes, we just need here the global temperature, and we deduce, so just some realization under the spatial and temporal training. And then knowing the global temperature, we know the distribution in each grid cell, at each time step. Then we deduce the local emissions of annual maximum temperature here. So we'll show you some example of the forms that we are trying to fit. And maybe it's a bit scary, but I'll just be very quick here to save some time. Basically, just putting the global trend of temperature in the location works really well. If you try to put something else, like global variability of temperature, the downward heat flux to the oceans, trying to fit like on the location and the scale and the shape, trying different things, we don't need that. Really, like we're using this metric that is used a lot in atmospheric sciences. Honestly, we don't need it. Simple is better sometimes. So how does it look like? Here, first two maps, that's MPI ESM for one system that we're trying to emulate. So the following maps, that's the example of emulations that we have. As you may see, for instance, column B, we are reproducing the top one quite well. There are some differences, and actually that's good. We're looking for that because we are sampling natural variability. That's different realizations. So spatial patterns look to be relatively well reproduced. Now looking at the time series, the red dots, so for instance, top one, that's the West and Central Europe, and then that's Southeast America, and then that's a point in the US, point in China. So what we observe is that the Earth system model, the red dots, and the emulations, black, gray, shaded area, some over the 90% range, we reproduce quite well the spread and the evolutions of the evolution in TX6. So apparently it works well. If I'm trying to be a bit more quantitative. So here, left, that's the ESM and then R6 regions. So for instance, if I'm taking the points right to the top, right to the right, it's for New Zealand and for Access CM2, trying to see how do we compare the quantile of our emulations to the quantile of here, Access CM2 in the region New Zealand. What we see here, it's blue, which means that we are slightly below, around 2.5%, even less. So mostly blue for the 95% quantile, not mostly red, so mostly above for the 5% quantile. Our emulations are slightly interdispersive. But what we see is that actually, in most of the cases, this deviation is limited to 5%. There are some differences a bit stronger for Sahara and for Southeast Asia. Honestly, trying to explain why, it's somewhat tricky. So, then an example of what we are doing is that, for instance, not all system models run all the SSPs from scenario MIP. So what we do is simply we take the twos that have been run, we deduce a global temperature pathway that we feed through all the emulators for each ESM that we have. And then we aggregate everything, which means that we have natural local variability plus the uncertainty in its modeling. When pulling everything together, that's what the maps that I have on the right for each SSP. Personally, what I think is interesting is that the maps that we have in SSP 119 for the 95% quantile is quite similar to the map of the 5% quantile in SSP 55. So something that happens usually once every 20 years in 119, 2100, happens like almost every year, or even worse, in 585. For instance, in looking the return periods now, the one that we have at 40 years in SSP 119, so that's the kind of events that we would have like this 5% increase in the anomaly in the annual maximum temperature. For just half a degree higher, it's 1 every 10 years. And when moving to 245, SSP 245, it's once every 1 or 2 years. So it is, it's quite a steep increase. Now, where do we stand now? We have submitted that. At the moment, I'm doing the response to the reviewers. So basically, we are showing how well it works for the distributions and spatial patterns and temporal evolutions. It seems to work. This method has been specifically designed to be capable to emulate any type of climatic streams. And here at the moment where I'm a bit sad that I'm not showing you the updated versions of the slides that was on the, because we have some results for the soil moisture, and it works. So to do so, we have some logistic evolution on the location using the temperature at T and T-1, and it works really well. We're also going towards fires. So yes, we are trying to do some nice emulators, and hopefully we can be able to couple that to different categories of models at some point, trying to do to bring some climate information. So if you have any questions, just feel free to drop me an email, to come to me, and I'd be more than willing to do stuff together. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. Now I know at least one of the 3 papers that cite my 2020. So we have time for one clarifying question, and then I'll jump on the podium and run through mine.
A daily sequence and then creating this distribution, or are you looking at kind of key points in the distribution and emulating those specifically to reconstruct the distribution? Could you say a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, I can show you.
No, usually you can't.
So what we are doing is doing annual emulations, but we are using like for instance, for annual maximum temperature, where we're taking just the maximum temperature of the year. But what I'm doing, for instance, for soil moisture, I'm taking the average over the year. What I'm doing for the fire weather index, I have this for annual. Thank you very much. This I cannot skip the slides. That's perfect, thank you. So for instance, here I'm using all the SSPs for training, not only one of them, and trying to pull off of my data of the realizations by the system models. And what I'm doing for the fire weather index, for instance, I have these 4 annual indicators, like the annual maximum, or the seasonal average, or number of extreme fire days, and so on and so forth. So it depends what kind of climatic extreme we want to provide. It depends. But at the moment, we focused on the annual resolution.
No, go ahead. I'm kidding. Quickly, though.
I'm just a question about the maximum, because maybe the maximum has not the same definition in each models, because they don't have the same resolution. So how do you deal with this?
Same tempo resolution?
But you're fitting things at the model level. But it's fitting every model to each of the ESM independently.
Yes. So
it doesn't mix
every grid point of the Earth system model, I'm taking all the evolutions in each, how to say that? Yeah, fitting local distribution for each grid point, and then doing that, this fit for each ESM. So I'm training for each grid point, each ESM. So that issue here is not, unless I didn't understand the question. Thanks to you.
Okay, and now for something awkward, I'm going to introduce myself. Can I have my present? Oh, thank you. Okay, so thank you for staying until the end. I'm going to talk about a new proposal we have for an emulator that we call comprehensive, and I hope you understand why we say so. It's a very different approach from what you have heard so far, much more simplistic, but it has some advantages. So I want to point out also that this work is together with 2 colleagues at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, Abigail Snyder and Kaylin Dorheim. So I don't think I need to motivate the use of emulators to this audience. So I'm just going to make the point that here I'm not talking about emulators that allow me to explore, the parameter space of ESM. I'm just talking about these emulators that we have already heard a couple of examples of, that are those that allow us, for example, to create a new scenario, and ideally we want internal variability together with the forced response. I do want to make the point that given the sophistication of our impact models nowadays, it's no longer the case that we can think of something, like a big decadal mean of one variable in isolation from the others. Most of our impact studies now require variables at very fine resolutions, both in time and space. Often more than one variable at a time. They usually require coherent trajectories in time. And of course, we want the emulator to do all that and to do it so quickly and with such agility that we can train it on many ESMs and maybe a new phase of CMIP generation, model generation quickly. And so you realize immediately that what I'm describing ends up having the complexity of an Earth system model. And so our idea was to go for the what I call the top-down approach, which is start from what's already there available from Earth system models and somehow cut pieces and patch them together to create new scenarios without trying to instead, like you have just heard, infer the statistical characteristics of the output, fit distribution, and then generate samples from that, which is a much more sophisticated approach, but it has the disadvantages of being computationally more tricky, especially when you want to do things, for example, across variables or across seasons or across days. Stitches takes this more simplistic approach, and I'm trying to describe it here in words quickly. So we start from a trajectory of global surface air temperature from an existing or a new scenario, which is usually what you start from when you want to emulate something new. This is our scenario that we call target, what we want to emulate. Then we choose from this, say, the CMIP6 archive the ESM that we want to emulate, and we extract and compute all the simulations of GSAT that ESM has provided. So all the scenarios, all the ensemble members available. And this constitutes our so-called archive from which we cut the pieces and we stitch them together to approximate our target trajectory. So we do so by splitting both the target and the archive trajectories into, let's say, 9-year windows. We use 9 years as a trade-off between having pieces that are small enough to create something new out of the old, but also to allow for some accounting of the internal variability. And the idea now is that for each of the windows in the target trajectory, we find the closest window in the archive trajectory, and we gather all these nearest neighbors for each of the windows, and we stitch them together. So let me just show you a figure. So this is all that is available in the CMIP6 archive by the Canadian model, which is a great model because they run all scenarios and they run a lot of ensemble members, so they're really making our life very easy here. So these are the 5, by now familiar SSPs. And you see here that I'm considering all the trajectories available, and I'm splitting them into small pieces. And then I'm thinking of having to create a new scenario that maybe happens to be between 4.5 and 7, let's say. So it's a new trajectory. I don't have anything in the archive like that. My IAM, my simple model has created this trajectory, probably. And I split that into 9-year windows as well. And then I transform this problem into a new space, because each of these windows, as you can imagine, can be characterized by many things, but can be characterized at least by 2 measures, which are the mean temperature change within that window and the mean rate at which that temperature is changing. So now I transform this situation into this new representation, which each point here now corresponds to one of those small windows that I showed. And of course, the color coding suggests which scenario you're looking at. You have the historical, and you have all the scenarios that form this nice and fairly populated cloud, thanks to the Canadian model that has run a lot of simulations. And now you understand that my new scenario is just a bunch of new points there. And now I go and pick the nearest neighbor for each of these. Possibly I have more than one, depending on my tolerance for what I call near. So in this case, I could actually create more than one trajectory from the existing ones, but let's say I just create one. And what the algorithm delivers now is just a series of pointers to the archive that says, if you want to recreate this trajectory, start from this 9-year window in this simulation of the model, and then go and take these other and patch them together. But the point here is that I'm not limited anymore to just take temperature, right? This is just a series of pointers to simulations that contain everything that the Canadian model has produced. And so I can create stitched trajectories of full fields of variables at the daily scale, at the monthly scale, whatever you want. And of course, there are caveats. It's not that it works for everything, but for many variables, this works. And for more than one variables at a time, of course, because you are maintaining all the coherence within these windows of the model output. And can somebody tell me if I'm going over, which is probably true, but I have my conclusions here. I should say we have a paper in Earth System Dynamics discussions that you can look for. It has my name on it, and I don't have many papers in EST, so you can find it. The point is that this is a method that if you understand is extending this idea of time sampling that has been applied to individual windows. For example, it has been the foundation of an entire special report of the IPCC at the time when we didn't have simulations that stabilized at 1.5. We used this approach by going and cutting out that period in the existing simulation where the global temperature got to 1.5 and drew all sorts of conclusions on the basis of those. Here we are just extending the idea to an entire transient simulation. Of course, one of the foundations of this is that a lot of variables behave in sync with global temperature, so we think this is going to work, but not all of them, right? There are variables that behave, with a delay or with hysteresis. So I'm not saying that this works for everything, but for many variables, all those that have been depicted in the last IPCC report by looking at global warming level, this should work. Of course, to recreate a new trajectory, you have to have a rich space in that archive, and your scenario doesn't have to be too different from what you have. And so you can imagine that given the content of the archive so far, we can recreate scenarios like I showed you, intermediate between what you have. You cannot create, of course, scenarios that are above or below what you have, but most importantly, you cannot recreate scenarios, for example, that have an overshoot, that has a negative rate of change, because you don't have enough in the archive right now to approximate those. So there are all those caveats, but we think that it's at least one proposal that may work for a lot of impact analysis. Of course, if you're interested in things like sea level rise, this is not going to work, because sea level rise does not only depend on the immediate value of global temperature, but how you arrived there and how long you have been there. But yeah, we have all these caveats in the paper, and in the paper, of course, we have a lot of validation that we can show, because we don't have only 10 minutes. And so we try to validate all that we have done as much as we can, and we just got the review, so we will do more. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm chairing. First of all, we are already 5 minutes, I think, over. I guess there is nobody that is taking this room, so if you guys want to stay, we can stay a few more minutes. If not, we can go. We have questions, yes. And of course, this is a time where you can ask questions to everybody, not just to me.
This is a really nice idea. So how, at the joins, how obvious are the discontinuities in
that's the first thing that we validated, as you can imagine. And they are not that obvious, because we do this by first smoothing the trajectories, and so we were concerned that once you put together, for example, daily data or monthly data that is not smooth, you could have, but it doesn't happen very often. It happens, but in a very, very small fraction of the joins. And so we are happy about that. There is, I guess the internal variability is such that it kind of accommodates for possible jumps. So of course, I'm talking about time series here, and you may argue that you may be in a phase of the PDO that it comes to a certain point, and now you're attaching something that comes from another phase. So one of the caveats is that probably, and we validated that ENSO works because of the 9-year window, but if you are interested, if your impacts depend on the phasing of some much longer modes, you may have a problem, but I cannot think of those.
So say you have like a point which is, at the same global mean temperature level, you have 2 points. The closest points are like distant in terms of gradient.
Mm-hmm.
Would there be a natural preference to choose, would there be a tendency to choose two parts which had different phases of the PDO? So these long, slow timescales of variability, you tend to choose the one which was negative at the end of the first stitch and the one which was positive at the end of the next.
Why would that be? I don't know.
Well, because if you're sparse, if the forced response has no point and sort of you're looking for interpolation in the middle,
yeah,
but the slow modes of internal variability allow you to get closer,
yeah,
then you might imagine that from your first part of the stitch, you might end up having a greater than average chance of having a PDO positive.
Mm.
The second one, you'd have a greater than average.
We haven't looked into that, to be honest, but we will.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask about, so as I understand it, you kind of have this 2D space, right, where you have the temperature anomaly kind of magnitude and then the rate of the warming within the stitch, right? And you kind of take the nearest neighbor within that space. And in that sense, you're kind of treating them equally, prioritizing them equally, right? So if you had your target and you had one stitch which was the same rate of warming but say 0.1 degrees warmer, and another stitch which was the same level of warming but 0.1 degree gradient different, they'd be treated identically, right? Is that the optimum? Is there space for an optimization where you're kind of stretching?
Right now we are just doing a very basic Euclidean distance in that space, but it's all, so we plan to post this code, and all these things are knobs that you can play around with. So maybe there is something to explore there. It's a good question.
Yeah, maybe to pick up on Ben's point and a little bit probably an area for improvement potentially. I mean, you could also just take 4 or 5 diagnostic variables for multi-decadal variability.
Right,
do more multidimensional mapping, and then you would kind of address that problem to some extent. Yeah, and I think it's really cool to use that. I have one question that then relates to another potential application area. And I mean, I know this is just kind of the start, so this is really, but I think it's really great idea. It's more to go towards high-risk MIP or these very, very high resolution, extremely computational expensive applications. Because I mean, for CMIP, we might have large ensemble MIP and other things that we can show how well this works. But then for the really expensive stuff, maybe this is an even I mean,
I can already tell you that it's a struggle when the model has only a couple of ensemble members.
Yeah.
You can create maybe one, but it's much better to have a rich archive than a poor archive. It's much better to be rich and healthy than poor and sick.
Okay.
But yeah. What I see though is a nice complementarity to Mesmer, for example, where we can attack the problem from different angles and build on each other. So I'm really excited about that. But I'll keep in mind the high res thing.
Absolutely.
Thanks. This question, I guess, goes both to Claudia and to Jan to continue the question I had from earlier. But maybe in this room it's known, but what is the computational expense here? Can you run through these really quickly? That's the appeal of the emulator, right? Is that we can do this fast. And the reason I bring it up is if I were to use this for a crop model type application, I would need to further bias adjust the outputs.
No, in the sense that you could create your stitched output from the bias corrected. Okay. So I think a lot, we are building on a lot of pre-processing, right? So you could prepare your archive from which you then sample, and that is an upfront cost. Then the nearest neighbor is very quick. What is not quick is then to go back to the archive and retrieve those windows, of course, but that is a cost that you have, maybe not as big, but you still have a cost when you retrieve the original simulations. But you know, there are different stages of this, and the archive part can be done a priori from bias-corrected simulations.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just ask one more thing and then hand the microphone over in case someone wants to reply. But yeah, I mean, so a further example, not just bias adjusted, but there's not only all the CIDs, the climatic impact drivers, but specific indices within every one. So in extreme heat, we can come up with dozens of specific thresholds. Yeah. So again, is the MESMA X that you're running something that can be done rapidly and customizably to an extent where a user could do it without necessarily always having to go through an expert modeler?
Thanks for the question. So first, regarding constraints, just like Claudia said, we could do some constraint thing if, so constrain the ESM projections, it's a bit tricky. But instead what we could do is to provide global temperature projections that are constrained, so that we use the patterns from and the natural variability from the ESMs, but with constraints, more observation-based projections of temperatures. Regarding the speed of calculation, yes, it's really fast. For us, the training takes like 1 hour, and to train like 1,000 emulations, it takes like less than that. So, but still, again, it's annual, whereas Claudia is doing up to daily. So, as she said, it's somewhat complementary.
And Stitches gives you the daily output if you want, and you compute all that you need, but it's up, yeah, it's on you. Oh, hi, Tim.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. I'm really happy to see this pattern scaling idea being taken forward now into the variability sphere, but also Claudia's method reminds me a bit of some global model work that's been done in Finland in the past as well, using these sort of slices to pull off temperature forcing or whatever. But I have a question for you, Claudia, in relation to the multi-model aspect and how you bring in the presumably you just be, if they're all bias adjusted, then presumably you can just use an ensemble set as well.
A what?
An ensemble rather than just using one model.
Well, the technique works within one model because you don't want to stitch
That's
things,
right.
because it's not just the bias adjustment.
Yeah. So how would one,
the modes and the patterns, you know. So
how would one take into account the multi-model? You'd have to have multiple
you would
stitches.
apply it to different
Yeah. So you still got to do quite a lot of simulation at the back end, at the impact end. Yeah.
Sure.
And then with the variability, I guess the variability change. I mean, you're focusing on one specific variable,
well,
TX.
the assumption is that variability...
This is the other way around. Sorry, the mesmeric, the mesmer method. Sorry, I'm not familiar with this modelling technique yet, so I haven't been looking into the literature recently. But yeah, for the impacts side, we probably need the full distribution of the temperatures, and we'd need the full distribution of the precip. If we were doing some simulations, and the simulations would probably need to be done sort of stochastically as opposed to being done consecutively through time, as you could do with a window, because with a simulation stitch, you've actually got temporal through time information, whereas with the statistical side, you've only got the statistics ready to work with, in a sense. For doing impact assessment, you could be working with the statistics, but without any sort of temporal sense to that, or am I misunderstanding? How could you actually use the emulator to look at the effect of extremes over time?
I'll let Jan answer, but the emulate that. No, I think that it's simple because your emulator is dependent on global temperature, which has somehow a time dimension.
Yes.
So he's simulating the entire distribution over time as well.
Yes, for us, our distributions are only dependent, so for TX6, it was only dependent on the temperature at this time step. Of course, there is some temporal autocorrelation, but still the main driver, it's really how warm it is at that point. So for instance, there are, of course, some questions regarding sensitivities, transient versus equilibrium. Chris has shown that it is important to use actually several scenarios. Low warming, high warming, trying to deal with transient versus equilibrium. Still for us, something that goes out of an overshoot scenario, but with the same global temperature, that would be somewhat the same distributions at that point. So how the past influence the current situation, the current local climate, it's more tricky to do. That's a big question, and honestly, how to do that in an efficient way, that's not easy, but that would be nice, yes.
I was about to say the same thing about the weather generator community really needs to be more involved. I don't know how we can get them into this, but it would be a very easy workflow to ask the weather generators what 5 parameters go into your generation. Then you could emulate those and then put them into the weather generator and then run a crop model. But there's also, of course, many things that you don't need a process-based model for, and something like the maximum temperature of the year is going to tell you your airport runway length and a bunch of other things directly.
Hey, part question, part comment, really, to all three presenters. Chris showed that there's a sort of a big difference if you're sort of interpolating or extrapolating your regional climate. And I was sort of, this is a transient versus equilibrium thing. So both Stitches and Mesmer-X effectively use global mean surface temperature. And we know sort of in a transient versus equilibrium regime, and we're talking about overshoot as well, we have sort of land and ocean behaving differently in terms of their regional climate. And I wonder, firstly, is there sort of any sort of plans to try and sort of take this into account? And secondly, what we possibly require from the sort of Earth system modeling community to better answer that question?
On that point, when I was doing 4TX6, I tried at some point to use not only the global trend of temperature, but also the downward heat flux to the oceans, because precisely of that question. And what I was saying is that in some grid points, it was slightly improving the projections, but really it was a small sample of them. So yes, for TX6, it didn't matter that much. Maybe for some others, it's more important. What I was saying with the soil moisture, for instance, is that there was a significant increase in the quality of my emulations when I was not only using the temperature at T, but the temperature at the former time step. Because, well, how much water there is in your soil depends not only over the year, but like former years. Maybe if I was going further, that would be even better. I don't know, didn't try yet. But then going further than that, I don't know. And if you have any ideas, any suggestions, I would be really glad to talk about it.
And I'll just add for Stitches works what is in the archive. So it's something we need to think about if we can influence, the next phase of CMAP to do experiments that kind of enrich that archive of behaviors that are not covered, and we can multiply. There is Detlef, and then if people need to leave, please feel free. Oh, it's a 2 fingers. Detlef, do you mind?
Yeah, I don't mind. Apologies, thanks. Yeah, I think there are a few questions, or like from my perspective, maybe to share in this regard. I think there's, when for temperature-based indices, this works a little bit better. If we want to go to precipitation or other things, the time-length component becomes more important. So I think kind of, we're looking into integrating precip into MESMA, and at least for temperature stabilization scenarios, we would see trends. And I think it depends a little bit on where we see, for example, some of the biggest questions in terms of understanding such things. I think what we see extremely encouraging, and I mean, it works for stitches great, and it works for emulators great, is kind of reproducing upward warming trend outputs, and they are consistent between scenarios. So I think we can say with some confidence that we have kind of a sufficient base to train emulators on the upward trend. We don't really know is if we have peak and decline scenarios or stabilization scenarios, what do we actually get out of those? Yeah. And there is a problem in terms of, kind of the way Earth system experiments would be set up, that we have difficulties in disentangling some of the different components there. So experiments that could help in this regard would be actually some experiments that would force stable temperatures, and you just see what happens. So you would basically, you would need to do forcing adjustments to force 100-year, whatever, 1.5 and 2 degree climate, and then see what you get out of those in terms of residual climate. And then you have others where you have concentration constant pathways, or you have basically the fully coupled scheme, so that you have an understanding of what of the components happen when. And I think another point, and then that's a little bit like there are others here, like Ben and others would have a much better overview of what experiments are out there and planned. But of course, there's a lot you could learn also from some stylized ESM experiments in that regard.
I agree, and I think for a lot of these questions, the type of simulations could be much simpler than what are driven by the holistic scenario forcings that we use for most. Detlef?
Yeah, so on one of the slides of the MESMA presentations, I don't know which one anymore, but there was this last question about what would be necessary to start coupling this within the IAMs, which might be a very interesting approach to go for. Just to speculate a little bit on that, it's more comment than a question. And so the IAM runs at the moment are somewhere between half an hour, I just asked the WITS team, and 10 hours, which is the case for image. I don't know exactly, something like message might be slightly longer because it's an optimization model, we are a simulation model. At the same time, we have LPGML included in the model, so that makes us, but that's, so in time frame, so if something takes an hour as an emulator, that is fine, I guess, for which it would be tripling of their time, but much longer it would be a problem for us. But I think the biggest exercise is probably making sure that the information that is provided by the emulators can be used by the IAMs. And so some IAMs do have already formulations of impacts related to climate change. Image has it for a very long time already. Some other models are now including that. But we don't have a response to extremes. And so we were already happy to start in simplifying and build responses based on annual means for cooling, for instance, or monthly temperature in the case of crops. But there is no response at all to extremes. And so if the drought would happen, in our case, our model would for 5 days not grow, but after that happily grow again. And so I think the most important thing would be to work with the impact community and formulate also some either simplified response curves that could be included in the IAMs, or really include the dynamics that respond to extremes, which might be even more difficult and maybe also more important for the computational time of the IAM than the emulator itself.
There is also the time step aspect, right? I know GCAM has a 5-year time step, and we may want to go back down to 1, but the regional scale.
Many IAMs don't have an explicit geographic pattern in there. They are simply regional, and then we just have to get the regional information out of this emulator, and it doesn't make. In our case, we would need the grid information. Yeah.
Oh, it never stops.
So regarding the time for computation and the information that can be used, actually comes down to one question is, do you want some stochastic realizations or do you want some average outputs? Do you want to group all of the distribution and then to say, okay, for that level of extreme, it means that much of impact, trying to transform the distribution from the hazard to the actual impact in some way, although you still need the exposure, and that comes from, and vulnerability, and that comes from the IM. So if using all the realizations, yeah, for sure, it adds for every time step, for every optimization step, my guesstimate would be like 5 minutes for each one of them. So that may be a significant increase in the computation. If you had a former computation before trying to deduce, if you had this hazard level and then combining with that much of population, some kind of function that says that, so that's clear with the climate community, climate impact community. But yes, if there you prepared the step beforehand to say if for that level of hazard, combining with that much, we know that there is that much of damage function on, so be it for the land, because that's where we're going to first. But yesterday there was some presentation for the energy, and they already have some stuff there. So it was for where you were there, so you know. But I'm sure that we can try to combine things so that we can have faster something that would not increase significantly the computation time. And of course, doing that regional scale, that would be feasible too.
So, and just go back to the point before about kind of the mean response and the pattern scaling. Is this point that came up kind of yesterday, I think a couple of times about, you know, with the scenario, with the SSPs, there was a kind of a sort of clear distinction to make sure that they all had, you know, different radiative forcings on the global scale, and there was kind of even pushback from modeling communities about ones that were kind of too similar because they were just like, oh, they're just going to be the same, basically. But I think, and obviously we can all kind of throw out scenarios we'd like to be included, and the trick is to narrow them down to a sensible set. But something which might be interesting to explore is the fact that for a given global temperature time series, you can have a very different regional pattern. And this is something which I was, you know, flagging in mind, is that with the pattern scaling, if you have the same global temperature time series, you're going to project the same regional response, the exact same response, just by definition. And so the trick is then, you know, can we factor other things into that into account? And maybe assuming that we can do that and that we've done that, you know, by the time these new scenarios come, it might be interesting to have two scenarios or whatever which are close in the global mean response, but different in interesting ways in the regional projections, whether that's aerosols or land use or whatever has this kind of regional component. And presumably, I mean, there's going to be a few which are around that low emission stabilization response, so they'll have that by definition, but just pointing out that's an explicit interest when it comes to emulation.
Do we still have time, Claudia? What time do we finish in theory? Okay. Okay, so we got 15 minutes still. Okay, cool. Just a few, I don't know, comments, thoughts, questions. I think Carl's suggestion, I think Ben made it also earlier, about having simpler experiments would be super helpful, because this thing of, you know, you have the SSP 245 and you've got CO2 changes, methane changes, aerosol changes, solar forcing in there. And it's a complete muck around trying to work out, you know, what's driving what behavior in the model. So for the next iteration of CMIP, it could be super helpful to have like more of these, I don't know, very idealized target experiments in different regimes, which we don't have at the moment. Like there's not a like CO2 only, well, there actually is. Okay, there is a CO2 only overshoot regime. This brings me to my second point, but very few models ran it. And so I think a lot of our design has been done really well in CMIP, but the prioritization doesn't work for every community. And so I guess there's a tricky question in here about how do you prioritize these simulations? So I think one of the CDR MIP people got up yesterday and said, we designed all these Earth system model or emissions-driven runs, but no one did them. And yet, like for the emulator community, we are screaming for those. They would be probably our #1 thing we would love to have more of. And so like somehow, either it's not a priority for them for some reason, or we can't get that message through, but trying to prioritize would be super helpful. I think Chris brings up a really interesting point about the regional differences. And I think it's actually a question probably for the IAM groups of, for example, if you look at the correlation between CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions in IAMs, it's super strong. And the reason is they're applying, for the most part, a global carbon price, and they're using GWPs. So pretty much you cut CO2 and then it gets too expensive, so you start cutting methane. And so you get these very strong couplings where they all basically get cut together. So you don't have any scenarios where you've got, I don't know, we decided that methane was great, so we're going to leave it high, but CO2 comes down really quickly, or vice versa. So you don't have that particular bit of diversity. And I wonder if you get a similar thing regionally too, where, because it's sort of a, I mean, it's not a completely global carbon price, but there's aspects of that you have similar regional patterns coming out from the IAMs, and I don't know what would be required to break that in an IAM, so you've got really different regional patterns that might already exist, but that could be part of the story too. Should I give the microphone to you, Detlef, or do you want more time to think?
So running those scenarios would be relatively easy. It's simply somehow we have focused pretty much on this, how to reach certain temperature goals, and then we assume that the whole world would be participating, but we can easily, and there are already some model comparison projects where some regions would not participate or very late. And they become more relevant, of course, now also with the net zero targets and set in different years in different regions. Yeah, and also the coupling of methane versus CO2, not having that consistent policy is something we can run. So if there is a demand for that, it's something that we can easily create.
Yeah, and I also endorse this idea from Chris about the sort of the different regional aspects of the forcing under given global warming. I think that would be quite an interesting thing to do. And in any case, it was done way back in the second assessment report with the aerosols when they were introduced. So I guess you had to capture that even in your IAMs somehow, or did you ever in those days? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, but the other point I wanted to make, though, and it goes back to my original intervention, which was about the full distribution, that there's a lot of focus, and of course I actually made comments on Working Group 1 report on this about the focus on hazard. Climate is a hazard. Climate is also a resource, and actually there are benefits in some regions, and beneficial climate extremes can be identified as well, you could imagine, but nobody looks at them. So that's why, for doing a balanced and comprehensive impact assessment, you need to look at the benefits as well as the negative side. So a proper impact analysis ought to be covering all of those aspects. And so thinking of it in terms of damage, and these terms I think are counterproductive in terms of communication in the first place. And also, they're feeding back on the research community who are just looking for the extremes and looking for the negative, when in fact they should be looking at the full distribution and actually looking actually for possible beneficial effects in the future. And how many people look at the climate models to see what combinations of climate might be beneficial in the future? Not many people do that. So I just want to flag that for the climate community, particularly climate science community. But maybe that's also something for the IAM people to think about as well. Probably you consider that you do look at the full range of impacts, but I suspect that maybe is not the case, actually. And I know politically it's not very, not politically correct, perhaps, to be looking at the beneficial side, but I think scientifically it has to be the way one looks at things.
As you know, Tim, you were our reviewers in Chapter 12, and Alex is here, is trying to veer a little bit towards a new framework with the climatic impact drivers that are by definition neutral. So there is maybe a little movement towards that. Ben?
So I guess a comment and a question. Look, the comment is on like CMIP design, and like there's a different, you would build a different ensemble if you wanted an optimal training set for the emulators we have today compared to the emulators we could have by the next assessment. And so, you know, that's perhaps something we need to think about, like, you know, what are the primary limiting factors in the assumptions which are going into the classes of emulator, which we've talked about, and you know, and what aspects of differences in climate simulations which don't necessarily differentiate global mean temperature pathways could we think about emulating on the time scale of the next assessment? So that's one thing. The second thing is to Jan on, like, so you present a convincing case that the model does a decent job of simulating, you know, 95th percentile of TXX, but like the really damaging events are probably 99th percentile, and Claudia gets that for free. And so, and also compound events, so sort of like joint, precip, temperature, whatever. Do you, I mean, how good is the model you have? What scope is there for getting at questions like that, like moving forward? What's your?
Thanks for the question. Regarding compound events, that's true that at the moment when I'm doing emulation of climatic streams, they are separate. They are not joint emulations of climatic streams. So droughts and heat waves will not be related with each other. That's an issue. I agree that if really high TX6, it's not unlikely that I will have also some droughts there. Doing that, though, from a statistical perspective, if you want to do with 2, it's okay. 3, it starts to be a bit tricky. And so on and so forth. The more variables you're trying to emulate together, and the more constraint you're putting on your sample, and then you will have, at the end of the day, to decrease the spatial correlations for us. What Claudia is doing, however, with stitches, it overcomes that. So that's really nice on these aspects. Regarding now the tail of the distribution, how far we can go and trust our emulations, for us, we went to the 595% quantile here. That's what we were showing. If we want to go further, it depends on how many members we have and how many ensemble members. Here I was showing with just one ensemble member, and yet it was working quite well. I'm working at the moment to use like as many ensemble members that I can. And yeah, for sure, I'm planning to try to go further in the tails of distribution, but the further you go and the more it depends on the shape parameter of the GEV. That's not an easy one to estimate. I cannot say how up to which return period I could trust my emulations. Once in 20 years, I think it's good. Once in 120 years, at the moment, not yet. Later with more ensemble members, maybe.
Ben, just 1 second, because Sonia, who is online through Zoom, would like to make a point, and given that she is co-chair, I think she has the priority. Can we put up Sonia, please?
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First, I want to say it's really great to see this very animated discussion. And so I have a few points. Maybe I'll just put everything together. But the first point was there was a question about applying observational constraints to emulators. So I just wanted to mention that we did a first application in this direction in a paper that's led by Lea Bosch. It was published 2020 in GRL. So we did this in Mesmer, and what we did was to look at the performance of ESMs either in terms of global warming or in terms of the regional scaling. And then the idea was that we could also create some new emulation where we basically switch the global sensitivity and the regional sensitivity. For instance, we can kind of create, we almost call this a Frankenstein kind of new emulation where basically we take different elements of the models and combine them together, so the global sensitivity and the regional sensitivity. But I think that's an interesting point about being even able to emulate models that don't exist, where you take the best aspects of each model. So that's one comment. The second comment I just wanted to bring up, and it's to you, Claudia. Actually, I enjoyed your presentation. I think it's very nice what you did in stitches. So only one point I think that could be an issue is the issue of autocorrelation. So ideally, you would want to have some type of persistence in the system. So for instance, if you have a drought, you would want to have some memory of, for instance, some moisture content. So I think that one element that we have in Mesmer that's also the autocorrelation is quite, would be quite useful to have in, physically consistent scenarios that you don't want to follow, for instance, a drought with some wet conditions. But to some extent, I think maybe merging the two approaches could work quite well.
Now I know that you are not a reviewer of my paper because we used that example as one of the caveats. So of course, things are consistent in stitches within the 9 years, and then you may introduce some jump or some inconsistency across the windows. And we use the example of the drought. A very persistent drought, multi-year drought could be lost. So thank you, Sonia. Ben, we have 6 minutes if we really want to take this to the end. Assuming that Sonia is done, do you want to ask your question? Okay. Are you guys tired enough of this? Well, if nobody wants to say anything else, I'll let Sonia actually first thank you, and because she wants it, if she's still there. No? Yes.
I'm still there. No, I'm still there. Well, I guess I just want to thank all the participants. I would have really loved to be there in person. Really tried to be there next time. But it was a great discussion, and I think there will be a lot of follow-up, I think, from this meeting. And thanks, Claudia, you did a great job on the channel. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you from me as well. And it was great to have these 45 minutes of bonus, and we made the best of it. So thank you very much to everybody, presenters and audience, and I'll see you around for another half day. And thank you to the technical help that has jumped in and resolved all these glitches and issues at the last moment. So we are really grateful for your work.